Welcome to MysteryCon. I hope you're ready, because tonight's video is all about aliens, UFO conspiracies, and secrets that will haunt you. Before we begin, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss what comes. Next, let's dive into the hidden stories that have been buried for decades, and the evidence that suggests we are not alone. They told me my grandfather died chasing phantoms across the ice, that the stories he left behind were just the fever dreams of a man who'd seen too much war. But the day I held that telegram yellowed, brittle, stamped with a Nazi eagle, I knew he'd been trying to warn me. I was still packing away his belongings when I found it wedged between his service records and a tattered leather-bound journal. The message was short, coded, and unmistakably German. Operation Gettermering Secured Energy Source Intact Contact Initiated. I read it twice, my pulse quickening. It sounded absurd, a secret Nazi mission under Antarctica, some lost technology. But in my line of work, investigative journalism, absurdity was often just the first layer. Back in my flat in Reykjavik, I spread the documents across my kitchen table, the edges curling in the draft from the window. My grandfather had sailed south with Operation High Jump in 1946. Officially, it was a U.S. Navy expedition to map the continent. But there had always been whispers that High Jump had another purpose. To hunt down the remnants of the Third Reich, I started digging. Declassified files, archived radio transmissions, anything I could find. The deeper I went, the more impossible it seemed to dismiss. British intelligence reports from 1947 mentioned anomalous heat signatures below the Ross Ice Shelf. Soviet memos hinted at an encounter near Queen Maud Land, an event that led to the sudden withdrawal of several research teams. I called in a favor from an old friend at Polar Sentinel Technologies. Within hours, encrypted satellite imagery filled my inbox. The photos showed massive elliptical heat blooms pulsing beneath 3 kilometers of ice. No known geothermal source could explain it. Even the volcanically active regions of Mount Erebus couldn't account for the scale. I kept telling myself this was just research and intellectual exercise, nothing more. But when I pulled back from the screen, I saw my own reflection in the glass, and I couldn't deny what was in my eyes. Fear. By dawn I had a plan. Santiago Station, the Chilean outpost near the edge of Sector Theta, maintained the most complete flight archives in the southern hemisphere. If the rumors about lost reconnaissance planes were true, that would be my next lead. Still, something felt unfinished. I returned to my grandfather's journal, its leather cover scarred from years of hard use. He'd written about machines in the sky, silver as mirrors, about men who did not belong to any country. Some entries trailed off mid-sentence, as if he'd lost the words or the will to finish them. When I finally closed the book, the sky outside was starting to pale, and my breath was fogging the window glass. I thought of the ice, of the thousands of miles of white silence that had swallowed so many secrets. I didn't know then that I was standing on the threshold of something vast, something that had waited decades to be found again. All I knew was that this story could either make my career or end my life. I zipped the telegram into my travel case, picked up my grandfather's journal, and whispered a promise to the empty room I would follow the trail to the end, no matter how deep it went. I arrived at Santiago Station under a sky the color of old bruises. The wind tore across the landing strip in long, cold gusts that made me pull my collar tight. The Chilean outpost was a collection of corrugated metal buildings, painted in fading reds and yellows, as if someone had tried to pretend this place was anything other than an exile at the bottom of the world. A young officer met me at the edge of the tarmac. He introduced himself as Lieutenant Alvarez, though he looked barely old enough to shave. His eyes flicked to the press badge clipped to my parka, but he didn't ask questions. Instead, he led me across a wooden walkway slick, with frost, and into the main operations building. Inside, the warmth was almost suffocating after the icy wind. A single kerosene heater hummed near the far wall, and the air smelled of fuel and old paper. I followed Alvarez past rows of steel cabinets and battered desks until we reached a heavy door marked Archivo de Volo. He gestured for me to wait, disappearing into the dim room beyond. I used the time to steady my breathing and remind myself why I was here, the lost flight. Captain Armand Rojas, a man whose last words had drifted through the airwaves like a dying confession. I'd read the transcript so many times I could recite it. They're not human. If this recording survives, tell the world. Alvarez returned with a battered folder in his hands. He set it on the desk in front of me and stepped back, watching. With a wary expression, I flipped open the cover. Inside were yellowed pages of a flight log, written in crisp, looping script. The date read June 12, 1952. The last entry was brief. Coordinates, altitude, a single notation that made the hair rise on my neck. Visual contact with unknown object circular, metallic emitting blue light. Evasive action initiated. I turned the page. Taped there was a photograph, edges curling, the image grainy. Against a backdrop of ice and cloud, a blurred disk hovered above the horizon. The shape was unmistakable. I looked up, my pulse heavy in my throat. "Has anyone ever authenticated this?" I asked. Alvarez shook his head. "You are the first person outside of official channels to see it. Most of the records were sealed before I was born." I studied the photo again, noting the way the shadows fell across the object. It was no weather balloon, no atmospheric mirage. Whatever it was, Rojas and his crew had died trying to escape it. I closed the folder and leaned back in the chair, the old wood creaking beneath me. For a moment, the room felt too small, the air too thin. All the warnings in my grandfather's journal were no longer just stories. They were evidence. When I finally looked up, Alvarez was still watching me. He hesitated before reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small cloth-wrapped bundle. "There's something else," he said, his voice low. This was recovered. Near the last known position of Rojas's plane, he placed the bundle on the desk and stepped back again. I unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a fragment of metal, smooth and curved, no larger than my palm. The surface shimmered with an iridescent sheen that seemed to shift color when I tilted it toward the light. Along one edge were tiny etched marking symbols I didn't recognize. I glanced at Alvarez, but he only shrugged. "Metallurgical analysis was inconclusive," he said. "No known alloy. No country claimed it." I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. I'd come looking for a lead, maybe even a story that could be dismissed by skeptics. Instead, I was holding something that should not exist. "I need to run a test," I said. Alvarez frowned. "We do not have much equipment here. I only need a magnet." He nodded and disappeared into the hallway, returning moments later with a small magnetic compass. I held the fragment over it, careful not to touch the needle. Slowly, the compass began to spin. Once, twice, then it stopped, pointing not to the north but to the fragment itself. I set it down, trying to ignore the tremor in my hands. "This isn't from any aircraft," I said quietly. Alvarez said, "Nothing," but I saw the unease in his eyes. For the first time, he looked as if he regretted letting me in. I wrapped the fragment again and slipped it into my satchel. My thoughts churned as I stood, trying to piece together what this meant, a vanished flight. A disc that could blind instruments, a metal that defied classification. I had come to Antarctica to chase a rumor. Now, I was standing on the edge of something far larger. As I walked back to the landing strip, the wind cut through my coat, but I barely felt it. I thought of my grandfather's last entries, of the way his words had trailed off into silence. Maybe he hadn't run out of things? To say maybe he had been warned to stop speaking. The engines of my charter plane thrummed in the distance. I reached the boarding ladder and paused, looking back at the station one last time. Alvarez stood in the doorway, watching. I raised a hand, but he didn't wave back. As the plane lifted into the cold, endless sky, I felt a new certainty settle. In my mind, I was not chasing myths. I was following a trail of evidence laid down by men who had seen something so extraordinary they could never speak of it again. And I knew I would not turn back. The flight back to McMurdo was silent, except for the steady drone of the engines. I sat near a frost-caked window, studying the fragment I had hidden inside a padded case. Each time I turned it, The surface caught the light in a way that made my pulse quicken. I had no idea what the symbols meant, but something about them felt deliberate, as if whoever made them had intended to leave a message no one could decipher. When the plane touched down on the ice runway, my shoulders ached with fatigue, but I forced myself to stay alert. I knew I was no longer an anonymous observer. Anyone who cared enough to bury the truth about Rojas's flight would not let me slip past unnoticed. I stepped off the plane into a hard wind that scoured my face raw. A lone transport waited at the edge of the runway, its headlights casting long beams across the snow. The driver was a pale man in a heavy parka who didn't bother to introduce himself. He only gestured for me to climb inside. I settled onto the cracked vinyl seat, clutching my satchel as the vehicle rumbled toward the main research complex. The sky had already darkened, the brief daylight swallowed by a bruised horizon. It felt as if the entire continent conspired to keep its secrets hidden in the cold. The driver stopped in front of the modular housing units, then turned to me. His eyes were flat and tired, but I recognized the look. He was waiting for confirmation that I understood the unspoken rules here. I nodded once, and he pulled away without another word. I entered my assigned cabin and locked the door behind. Inside, the space was a cramped rectangle lined with aluminum walls and a bunk bolted to the floor. I set the satchel on the table and reached for the radio, intending to call Solberg, the Norwegian glaciologist who had helped me secure access to the archives. Before I could pick up the handset, there was a soft knock on the door. My breath caught. No one should have known I had returned so soon. I waited, counting the seconds, hoping whoever stood outside would give up. Instead, the knock came again, firmer this time. I moved to the door and eased it open an inch. 3 figures stood in the darkness, their parkas marked with a crest. I did not recognize a stylized globe encircled by laurel leaves. The man in front stepped closer. His voice was calm, but the tone carried an edge that made my skin tighten. "Miss Nix, we need you to come with us." "Who are you?" I asked, my hand tightening on the doorframe. "Global Antarctic Research Consortium," he replied. "GARC," I hesitated. The name was familiar from scattered reports and offhand remarks by scientists who always dropped their voices when mentioning it. I had assumed it was just another multinational treaty organization tasked with enforcing environmental protections. But the way these men stood their measured stillness told me I was wrong. "I'm not going anywhere without an explanation," I said. The man's jaw shifted slightly, as though he was weighing whether to force the issue. Then he reached into his coat and held out a laminated identification card. I didn't touch it. I only read the bold letters printed across the top. "Directive Enforcement Unit." He spoke again, his words precise. "You are in possession of restricted materials. You will accompany us now?" I weighed my options. Running was pointless. My only chance was to stall long enough to learn why they had come. I stepped back and gestured for them to enter. The 2 others flanked the door as the leader stepped inside. He scanned the cramped cabin, then turned to face me. "Your investigation is over," he said. "You will surrender all evidence you have collected." "You think threatening me will make this disappear?" I asked. "You don't understand what you're protecting." His gaze did not waver. "You don't understand what you are endangering." My throat tightened. There was no point denying I had the fragment. I unzipped the satchel and removed it, holding it flat on my palm. The man studied it for a moment, then nodded to his companions. One stepped forward with a black case lined in foam. I knew if they took the fragment, my proof would be gone. Before I could react, the door behind them swung open. Slamming against the wall, Dr. Peter Solberg stood in the doorway, his face pale with urgency. "Don't let them take it," he said, his voice harsh. The GARC agents turned in unison, hands moving toward concealed weapons. Solberg held up both palms, stepping inside slowly. "You're making a mistake," he said, to the leader. "You know as well as I do that this is no ordinary relic." The man's expression tightened. "You were instructed to remain in Norway." "I came because I know what you're doing here," Solberg said. "You're not protecting the treaty," You're covering up something that has been buried since before any of us were born." No one spoke. The air in the cabin felt charged, as if any movement would shatter the fragile balance. Finally, the leader lowered his hand. He looked at me, then back to Solberg. "You have 24 hours. After that, if you do not leave Antarctica, we will consider you hostile operatives." He turned sharply and walked out, his companions following without a word. The door closed and silence fell. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. Solberg exhaled slowly. "They won't wait 24 hours, he said. "We need to move." I picked up the fragment, its weight heavier now that I understood how far Gark would go, to keep it hidden. Solberg met my gaze, and I saw the same certainty that had carried me this far. There would be no turning back. Without speaking, we began to gather what we could. We left the outpost before dawn, when the sky was the color of slate, and the ice creaked in long, hollow sighs beneath our boots. Solberg guided me to a snowcat parked near a row of fuel drums. He moved with quiet urgency, checking the treads and testing the radio before motioning for me to climb inside. The cab was unheated, and the cold soaked through my gloves as soon as I touched the seat. We drove in silence, the treads grinding across uneven drifts until the lights of McMurdo vanished behind us. I watched the darkness ahead, feeling as if we were crossing a border that no map could mark. Solberg spoke finally, his voice low and rough. "We'll be safe for a little while. The consortium has limits, even here. Where are we going?" I asked, my breath fogging the windshield. "Mount Erebus," he said. "There's a cavern system beneath the western face. It was used during the war as a supply cache. No one goes there anymore." I didn't ask how he knew. I only tightened my grip on the fragment in my coat pocket. Hours passed in a blur of white and shadow. When we finally stopped, the engine ticked in the cold while Solberg retrieved climbing gear and a canvas pack from the rear compartment. He handed me a headlamp and nodded toward a narrow opening in the ice wall. "Stay close," he said. I followed him through a tunnel no wider than my shoulders, the walls glinting with frozen crystals that sparkled under our lights. The air was stale and heavy with the scent of old fuel and rust. After a few minutes, the passage widened into a cavern, the ceiling lost in darkness above us. I turned slowly, taking in the crates stacked in neat rows along the walls. Most were stenciled with German markings, black eagles, and faded swastikas. Solberg set his pack down and knelt beside one of the crates. He pried it open with a small crowbar, revealing layers of oilcloth wrapped around bundles of paper. He lifted one out and unfolded it with deliberate care. The blueprint was brittle, its edges crumbling at the touch. Across the top, in block letters, were the words Project Morgenstern. The diagram showed a vessel shaped like a flattened disc, with a cross-section of chambers and conduits radiating from a central sphere. Along the margins were notations in a tight, angular script I couldn't read. Solberg turned the page so I could see a smaller sketch in the corner, a component labeled Schwarz on Antrieb, the Black Sun engine. I looked up at him, feeling the weight of everything we were uncovering press against my ribs. "How much of this did you already know?" I asked. He sighed, his breath white in the beam of his lamp. "Enough to understand why they tried to erase it. This technology didn't come from any human laboratory." I traced one gloved finger along the outline of the engine. The design was too refined to be a prototype. It looked finished, almost elegant. "Do you really believe the Nazis built this with help from something other?" Solberg didn't answer at first. He only unrolled another sheet of blueprints. This one was a technical manual, the text printed in German with diagrams that reminded me of the alloy fragment in my pocket. "I don't believe," he said finally. "I know. My grandfather worked with the Norwegian resistance. After the war, he told my father stories about an installation in Neuschwabenland, about shipments of equipment that vanished under the ice. For years I dismissed it. But then I started seeing the same symbols etched into glacier cores. A cold shiver moved up my spine. And Gark? They're the stewards," Solberg said. "They tell themselves they're protecting the world from panic. Maybe they are. But the truth is simpler. They don't want anyone else to have this power. I looked around the cavern, feeling the hush that filled the air like a held breath. Each crate was a piece of history that had been buried so carefully no one would ever find it by accident. I pulled out my camera and began to photograph everything, the markings, the diagrams, the faded stamps. Solberg didn't stop me. He only moved from crate to crate, reading labels and setting aside what seemed most important. We worked like that for nearly an hour, until the first faint vibration shuddered through the floor. I froze, holding my breath. The vibration came again, stronger this time, rattling the crates in their stacks. Solberg looked at me, his face gone pale. "They're here." I swallowed, forcing my voice to stay steady. How could they have tracked us so fast? He checked his watch and closed the nearest crate with trembling hands. "They have sensors everywhere. I hope this place was forgotten, but I was wrong." I packed the camera into my bag and reached for the fragment. "What do we do?" Solberg met my gaze. "We leave now. If we're lucky, they'll destroy the evidence, but let us go." He didn't sound convinced. We moved quickly, securing the blueprints and sealing the crates we had disturbed. When we reached the tunnel, I risked one last glance back. A thin crack of light appeared along the far wall, as if the ice itself were breaking open. We scrambled into the passage, the walls vibrating around us. Outside, the wind had risen, scouring the snow into blinding sheets. We climbed into the snowcat, and Solberg fired the engine just as a muffled explosion echoed from deep within the mountain. I didn't look back as we pulled away. I knew what I would see: fire melting through the cavern, erasing every trace. As the snowcat carried us into the darkness, I felt a grim certainty settle in my chest. The war my grandfather had fought had never ended. It had only gone underground. By the time we reached the coast, the snowcat was nearly out of fuel. The wind had eased, leaving the sky clear and hard as glass. We took shelter in an abandoned Norwegian weather station perched above the ice cliffs. The building was little more than a box of timber and corrugated iron, but it offered enough protection to regroup. Inside, I spread the documents we had saved across a narrow table. The blueprints and manuals were brittle with age, yet their meaning felt alive, humming beneath every faded line. Solberg warmed his hands over a small propane heater. His eyes were hollow from exhaustion. I knew we couldn't stay here long. Someone would come to finish what Gark had started. I picked up the schematic of the Black Sun engine, studying the notations along the margins. My grandfather's handwriting was there, small and precise, translating sections into English. It felt like he was speaking to me across the decades, warning me that this story was bigger than either of us. Solberg looked up and nodded toward the schematic. "You need more than diagrams," he said. "You need a witness." I raised my eyebrows. "Who?" He hesitated, then reached into his pack and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "There's a woman in Oslo. Her name is Ingrid Foken. She was an engineer on the Morgenstern project. I've tried to contact her before, but she never responded. Now she might understand how urgent this is." I took the paper from him. It was a photocopy of a personnel file. Her photograph, stamped with an eagle crest, stared back at me. Her eyes were clear and intelligent, but her expression was cautious, as though she already knew the cost of what she was building. I traced the date beneath her name, March 1945. "If she's still alive," I said quietly, "she might be our last chance to confirm any of this." Solberg nodded. "We have to try." We packed what we could carry and left the rest hidden under floorboards. A cargo plane from the Norwegian Polar Institute agreed to take us north. The pilots didn't ask questions when they saw our battered equipment and frostbitten faces. We were just two more scientists trying to escape the ice. As the plane lifted away from the coast, I looked out the window at the endless white below. Somewhere beneath it, the cavern still smoldered with the remains of the evidence we had left behind. For the first time since I arrived in Antarctica, I wondered if I had already lost the war one was fighting. We reached Oslo after 20 hours of flight and customs delays. The city was a shock after weeks of ice and darkness. Streets glowed with shop lights and the chatter of people who had no idea what lay hidden at the bottom of the world. We took A taxi to a quiet neighborhood lined with old brick buildings. Solberg checked the address twice before leading me up 3 flights of narrow stairs. At the top he paused, his hand hovering over the doorbell. "She may not talk to us," he said. "Then we'll find another way," I replied. He pressed the bell. After a long silence, the door opened a crack. A woman's eyes appeared, faded blue and watchful. She studied us without speaking. Solberg cleared his throat. "Miss Falcon, my name is Peter Solberg. This is Alara Nix. We're here because we believe you can help us understand what happened in Neuschwabenland." The door stayed half closed. "I have nothing to say," she murmured, her voice thin but steady. I stepped closer, my heart thumping. "I think you do," I said. "I have your project files? I know you helped design the engine. I know why you hid." For a moment, she didn't react. Then her eyes flicked to mine, sharp with something like recognition. "Come inside," she said quietly. The apartment was small and smelled of old. Books and tea. Ingrid Falcon moved slowly, her hands tremoring as she gestured us to sit. She lowered herself into an armchair and rested her cane across her knees. Her gaze settled on the folder in my hands. "I was young when they recruited me," she began. "They told me we were building an energy source that would save Germany, but it was never ours to understand." Her voice gained strength as she spoke. She described the cavern in Neuschwabenland, vast hangars carved beneath the ice, chambers filled with silver discs resting on pedestals. Scientists working in secret, communicating with voices that spoke through radios in a language no one could translate. "They called it technological salvation," she said. "But it was never about salvation. It was about control." I felt the chill in the room deepen. "What happened when the war ended?" I asked. Her gaze drifted to the window. "The Americans came, the British, even the Russians. They took what they could. But some things were buried again, left behind because no one dared bring them into the world." She met my eyes. "The consortium you've met, they were born out of that decision?" A tremor passed through her hand, and she pressed it against her chest. "I'm tired," she whispered. "I never thought anyone would come asking after all this time." I wanted to ask more, but her head bowed as though she could no longer hold its weight. Solberg stood and touched my shoulder. "Let her rest," he said. As we moved toward the door, I glanced back. Ingrid Falcon sat motionless, her face turned to the window, eyes closed. It looked as if she had simply gone to sleep. But in the stillness, I knew she would never wake again. Outside, the wind rattled the glass panes. I felt the weight of everything she had told us settle into my bones. We walked down the stairs without speaking. When we reached the street, Solberg turned to me. "Now you understand," he said. I nodded, feeling a cold resolve harden in my chest. We had proof. And now we had a witness, one whose final words could not be buried. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of movement. Solberg and I took the earliest flight back to Punta Arenas, the southern edge of Chile, where supply ships and research vessels came and went under flags from a dozen nations. We rented a small room above, a shipping office near the harbor. I spent every waking moment cataloging what we had collected. Ingrid Falcon's testimony was already transcribed, her voice preserved on a handheld recorder. The documents she'd confirmed were sealed in waterproof bags, labeled and numbered. Solberg paced as I worked, checking the window every few minutes, as if he expected a black convoy to roll up the cobblestone street. We knew our time was limited. Gark would learn of Ingrid's death soon enough, and when they did, they would understand she hadn't died alone. By evening, I had packaged a duplicate set of the files and mailed them to a contact in New York. It was a small insurance policy in case we never made it out. Solberg watched me seal the last envelope, his expression lined with worry. "We need more than documents," he said, "a broadcast. Something no one can suppress." I nodded, but I knew the danger was growing faster than our options. I closed the blinds and switched off the lamp. The room fell into darkness except for the amber glow of the harbor lights filtering through the slats. That night I dreamed. of Ingrid's eyes wide and bright as she spoke of hangars beneath the ice. I woke before dawn to the sound of Solberg's voice in the hallway. He was speaking in low tones to someone I couldn't see. I dressed quickly, slipping the recorder into my coat pocket. When I stepped outside, I found Solberg standing with Eric Vega, the guide we had hired weeks earlier to help us cross Sector Theta. His breath rose in white plumes as he turned to me. "I heard you were back," Vega said. "And I heard you." "We're in trouble?" Solberg looked uneasy. I realized he hadn't told me he'd reached out for help. "We can't do this alone," Solberg said. "He knows the terrain, and if we're going to find the installation, we'll need his skills." Vega shifted his pack higher on his shoulder. "Gark isn't the only threat," he said. "Winter's closing in. If you wait much longer, the passes will be impassable." I studied his face. His eyes were calm, too calm for the urgency of our situation. But Solberg was right. We needed someone who could move us through the ice unseen, I nodded once. "All right, we leave tonight." Vega gave a thin smile. "Then, you'd better rest. It'll be a hard crossing." As the sun rose, I went over our plan again and again, searching for gaps. I knew Gark had more resources than we could imagine. If they wanted to find us, they would. But I told myself we still had one advantage: surprise. That evening we boarded a battered snow crawler and headed south along the coast. The machine shuddered over rough ice, its headlights casting twin beams that vanished into the darkness. Hours passed in tense silence. Solberg reviewed coordinates while I watched Vega drive. His gloved hands never left the wheel. His expression never changed. At dawn, we reached Camp Erebus, a cluster of prefabricated shelters and fuel tanks. It was a place few people visited, a waypoint for expeditions that never made the news. We parked near a storage shed and stepped into the biting wind. I followed Solberg inside, my boots crunching over old snow that had drifted through a broken doorframe. He unrolled a satellite image on a workbench. A thin black line marked a ridge where heat signatures had been detected weeks earlier. "This is where we'll find it," he said. Vega's voice came from behind us, quieter than the wind. "No, this is where you'll lose it," I turned, but he was already raising his weapon, the barrel leveled at Solberg's chest. My breath caught. Solberg froze. "Eric," he said slowly, "you don't have to do this." Vega shook his head. "You think Gark didn't see this coming? You think they wouldn't embed someone to watch you?" He gestured with the gun. "Step away from the table." My mind raced. The recorder was still in my pocket. If he searched us, he'd find it. I met Solberg's eyes. I saw the same thought there. Vega moved closer, his boots scuffing over the ice-caked floor. "I didn't want this," he said. "I told them you wouldn't get this far, but here you are." He reached for my pack. I stepped back, feeling the recorder press against my ribs. "Don't," I whispered. "It's too late," he said. The air split with a sharp crack. For an instant I thought he had fired. But Solberg had swung the edge of the workbench up, catching Vega's wrist. The gun skidded across the floor. I lunged for it, my hands numb with cold and fear. Vega struck Solberg across the face, sending him crashing into the wall. I gripped the weapon, my heart hammering so hard I couldn't think. Vega turned toward me, his mouth twisting in anger. I squeezed the trigger. The report was deafening in the small space. Vega staggered back, eyes wide, then collapsed against the doorway. Silence fell as quickly as the echo had come. I didn't move. My hands still gripped the gun, the barrel. Shaking, Solberg pushed himself upright, wiping blood from his lip. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "You did what you had to," he said quietly. I swallowed, tasting the sour edge of fear and regret. We knew now that Gark would come for us without hesitation. There was no more hiding, no more pretending we were only gathering evidence. As we stepped back into the darkness, I felt the recorder against my ribs, the last fragment of Ingrid's story still safe. It would have to be enough to keep us going. We left Camp Erebus before dawn, driving east along a frozen corridor between two mountain ridges. The crawler's engine throbbed in the quiet, each vibration a reminder that we had no margin left for mistakes. Solberg drove without speaking, one gloved hand on the wheel and the other pressed to his bruised cheek. He hadn't complained once about the pain? I thought of Viga's last expression as he fell, a mix of anger and something close to relief. I pushed the memory away. We couldn't afford to dwell on what we'd done. Survival depended on staying focused. At midday, we stopped beside a field of broken ice where fissures yawned wide enough to swallow a vehicle whole. Solberg switched off the engine and turned to me. "We have to decide," he said. "If we keep going without a plan, they'll find us before we find the installation." I opened the recorder and replayed the last minutes of Ingrid Falken's testimony. Her voice was thin but certain. She spoke of a secondary facility, a place referred to in whispers as Sector Omega. I closed my eyes, picturing the old schematic she had described. A circular ventilation system? A hidden chamber with a second power source. I had memorized the details, but I needed confirmation. Solberg rummaged through a battered canvas bag, pulling out the folded blueprint he'd salvaged from Mount Erebus. He spread it across the dashboard and traced a gloved finger along the margin where a set of coordinates had been marked in pencil. The notation was faint, but legible: 78 south, 142 west. It was an uncharted region well beyond any official expedition zone. "This is it," I said. "If we can get close enough, the drones can confirm it." Solberg nodded, but I could see doubt in his eyes. He knew as well as I did that the deeper we went, the fewer chances we would have to turn back. We drove on through a labyrinth of ridges and drifted snow. Hours passed. The sky turned a bruised purple as night fell. Solberg kept one hand on the satellite radio, listening for any chatter that might betray approaching teams. But the frequencies were silent. That worried me more than any transmission. At last, we reached a plateau where the ice leveled into an unbroken sheet. Solberg killed the engine and climbed out. I followed, boots sinking into powder that gleamed under the weak starlight. The cold bit through my clothing, but I ignored it. This was where Ingrid's map ended, where every rumor pointed. Solberg carried the reconnaissance drone in a hard plastic case. He set it on the ice and powered it up, the small rotors whining as it came online. I held my breath as the screen lit with a grainy feed. The drone lifted into the darkness, its camera panning across the ice fields. I watched the display as the terrain rolled past in shades of blue and gray. Minutes crawled by without any sign of the installation. My heartbeat thumped against my ribs, every second feeding the doubt in my chest. Then, near the edge of the transmission range, the camera caught something, a straight line cutting across the snow. Solberg zoomed in, adjusting the angle. The line became a vent shaft, no wider than a hatch cover. Heat shimmered from its edges in a faint plume. "That's active," I said, my voice low. "Something is generating power down there." Solberg didn't answer. He guided the drone lower until its camera pressed against the grate. Through the slats, I glimpsed the faint glow of light. I turned to Solberg. "This is the evidence we need. No one can deny it if we record everything." He nodded but didn't look away from the screen. "It also means they're here already." He said, "Whatever this place is, it hasn't been abandoned." A chill that had nothing to do with the cold settled into my bones. I knew he was right. If Gark had guarded Mount Erebus, they would have tripled their efforts to protect Sector Omega, the drone's battery alarm chirped. Solberg brought it back, landing it carefully beside the crawler. He shut it off and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before, something between resignation and grim determination. "We have a choice," he said. "We can transmit what we have and disappear, or we can go in." I knew he wanted me to say we should leave, that we had enough proof to blow the story wide open. But I also knew that without physical evidence, without undeniable documentation of what lay beneath that ice, every government on Earth would deny it all. They'd say the footage was faked, that we were delusional. I looked back at the faint plume of heat on the horizon, and I felt a quiet certainty settle over my fear. "We go in," I said. Solberg didn't argue. He packed the drone away and returned to the driver's seat. I climbed in beside him, feeling the recorder press against my ribs. It was the last link to Ingrid's testimony. If we failed, at least that story would remain. As we started the engine and turned towards Sector Omega, I glanced over my shoulder at the track we were leaving behind. Snow had already begun to drift across it, erasing every trace of our passage. Ahead, the ice stretched into darkness, silent and absolute. Whatever waited beneath that glacier was closer than ever, and there would be no turning back. We drove through the night, navigating by dim satellite readings and the glow of the vent plume on the horizon. The crawler shuddered over deep ruts and wind-scoured drifts. Each time the track slipped sideways, my chest tightened with the fear that we would be stranded in the cold before we ever reached Sector Omega. Solberg drove with both hands gripping the wheel, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. He barely spoke except to confirm our heading or check the battery life on the drone. I knew he was thinking the same thing I was that the moment we breached the installation. There would be no going back to any life we had known before. At dawn, we crested a ridge and looked down onto a wide basin carved into the ice. From a distance, it looked like a crater. Steam rose from vents that ringed the depression, each plume drifting into the pale morning sky. In the center stood a structure, unlike anything I had ever seen. It was a perfect circle of black material, as if a massive coin had been pressed into the glacier. Around its edge, faint blue glyphs pulsed in an unbroken line. The frozen gate, Solberg stopped the crawler at the rim of the basin and turned off the engine. For a moment, neither of us moved. The silence was complete, oppressive. When I finally stepped out, the cold hit me so hard I gasped, but I forced myself to walk to the edge and look down. The black circle was at least 40 meters across. Heat shimmered above its surface, and the snow around it had melted back to reveal polished ice etched with more symbols. I turned to Solberg. His face was pale in the half-light. "This isn't man-made," he said, his voice flat. "No one on Earth could build this here." I swallowed, feeling the truth settle in my chest. All the rumors, all the stories of hidden technology and unknown collaborators, they were more than fragments of propaganda. They were warnings. Solberg retrieved the drone and prepared it for another flight. As he worked, I walked slowly around the basin, searching for any sign that the place had been disturbed. I found no tracks, no equipment, no evidence of Gark patrols. It was as if the installation had waited decades for someone to return. The drone lifted into the sky with a quiet hum. Solberg guided it in a slow orbit above the circle. The live feed flickered on the handheld screen. From above, the glyphs were clearer concentric bands of symbols and narrow channels that looked like conduits. Every few seconds, a pulse of blue light rippled across the surface, flowing along the etched lines before fading into darkness again. "It's active," Solberg whispered. Even after all this time, I felt a cold prickle along my spine. "Get as much footage as you can," I said. "We'll need every second if we're going to convince anyone this is real." He didn't reply. His hands were steady on the controls, but his jaw was clenched tight. The drone hovered lower, the camera panning across the structure. In the center of the circle was a depression no more than 2 meters across. From this angle, it looked like a hatch or an access point. My throat tightened. It felt as if we were standing at the edge of something older than memory itself. A soft chime sounded from the drone. Solberg looked at the battery indicator and frowned. "We have maybe 15 minutes before the cold kills it. Then we finish quickly," I said. He maneuvered the drone over the hatch, focusing on a row of symbols that glowed brighter than the rest. As the feed sharpened, I saw they matched the markings etched into the alloy fragment in my pack. My heart thumped hard against my ribs. That was the final proof I needed. The fragment and the gate were linked, built from the same knowledge. The same impossible science. Solberg lifted the drone higher to capture a final wide shot. But as he did, an alarm sounded from the crawler. I turned in time to see the satellite uplink antenna rotating, searching for a signal. Solberg set the controller down and ran to the console. "They're scanning for us," he said. His voice was calm, but I heard the strain in it. "If they lock onto our transponder, we have less than an hour." I forced myself to think. "Transmit the data now." Even if they find us, the evidence will be out. He hesitated, then nodded. His gloved fingers worked the console, copying the drone footage onto a drive and prepping the uplink. I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen, willing it to move faster. The blue pulses continued to flicker across the gate, steady and deliberate, as if responding to our presence. A thought took shape in my mind, cold and undeniable. The gate was not only still functioning, it was waiting for something. The drive finished copying. Solberg slipped it into his jacket. "I'll send it to every open channel we have," he said. "Once it's out, we run. Run where?" I asked. He met my eyes, and I saw the truth there. It didn't matter. There was nowhere left to hide. We would either get this out or vanish trying. I turned back to the ridge. The first rays of sun caught the glyphs, sending a pale shimmer racing along. The lines. For a moment, I felt as if the ice itself had come alive, listening to us. When I looked down into the depression, I saw the faintest glow rising from beneath the hatch. I didn't say anything. Some things couldn't be explained. Solberg keyed the transmitter, and the crawler's antenna locked onto the nearest satellite. As the signal pulsed into the sky, I pressed one hand over the fragment in my pocket. Whatever lay beneath the ice, we were closer to it now than anyone had ever dared. And if this was the last thing I would ever see, at least I would know the truth had been real. The transmission took less than 5 minutes to complete, but it felt like hours. I watched the uplink light pulse green, each blink a promise that the files were moving through satellites to every channel we could reach. Solberg kept one eye on the scanner, listening for any sign that Gark had intercepted us. The feed stayed quiet, an emptiness that made me more uneasy than any alarm. When the final confirmation came through, Solberg powered down the antenna. "It's done," he said. His voice was rough but steady. "If they're watching, they'll know we sent it." I looked back at the frozen gate. The blue glyphs continued their rhythm, each flare of light tracing an ancient pattern. It was clear this structure had not been dormant. Something had kept it alive all these decades, pulsing in the dark while the world above forgot it existed. I turned to Solberg. "We need to see what's inside." He studied the hatch in the center of the circle, then gave a single nod. "If we don't get proof from the source, they'll still deny it. This is our only chance." We packed only what we could carry: cameras, the alloy fragment, a pair of chemical lamps. Solberg slung a climbing harness over his shoulder. We crossed the basin slowly, watching for sensors or hidden tripwires, but the ice was undisturbed. At the edge of the hatch I crouched and studied the seam. Faint heat radiated from the gap, enough to fog my breath. Solberg knelt opposite me and traced the markings that framed the edge. "These symbols," he murmured. "They look like control indicators." I reached for the alloy fragment and held it near the hatch. The glyphs pulsed brighter. A soft vibration passed through my palm, so subtle I almost thought I imagined it. Solberg's eyes widened. "Whatever this is, it's keyed to the material." Before I could speak, the hatch shuddered and split along the seam. A thin line of blue light spread outward, forming a perfect ring. The hatch rose with a slow, grinding motion. I stepped back as warm air rushed over my face, carrying a scent I couldn't name, metallic but sweeter, like ozone after a storm. The opening revealed a vertical shaft descending into darkness. Solberg uncoiled a rope and clipped it to a metal loop beside the hatch. He tested the line with careful force, then glanced at me. "Stay on the radio," he said. "If anything happens, you pull back." I nodded, but I knew I would follow. He lowered himself over the edge. Boots braced against the smooth wall. I counted each meter as he descended, my breath tight in my throat. When his voice finally crackled through the radio, I felt a wave of relief. "It opens into a chamber," he said. "No signs of recent activity. I'm going to set up the lamps." His light flickered across the shaft walls, revealing more. Glyphs etched into the material. The designs looked almost organic, like roots threading through soil. I hooked my harness to the line and began my descent. The warmth increased as I went lower, and the walls grew smoother, as if they had been polished by some process beyond human engineering. When my boots touched the floor, I unclipped the harness and looked around. The chamber was vast, at least, 30 meters across, with a domed ceiling that disappeared into darkness. The walls were lined with consoles rows of curved surfaces inset with crystal panels. Many were dark, but a few glowed with pale symbols that shifted like flowing water. Solberg set a lamp on the floor, casting a circle of golden light across. The nearest console. He brushed dust away, revealing a recessed panel. "These look like data recorders," he said. "If they still work, they could tell us everything." I drew in a slow breath. "Let's try." He pressed his palm against the panel. For an instant, nothing happened. Then a low tone filled the chamber, vibrating through my chest. The consoles flickered to life in sequence, each one chiming as symbols rippled across the displays. A voice spoke, deep and resonant, layered in harmonics that made my skin crawl. I couldn't understand the language, but the cadence was deliberate. Almost solemn, Solberg's eyes met mine. "It's a recording." The voice continued, shifting between frequencies. A second voice joined it, higher and more precise. They spoke in turns, then together like a dialogue. I fumbled for the recorder in my pack and set it on the console. The device's indicator blinked red, capturing every sound. The resonance of the voices seemed to thicken the air, pressing against my eardrums. I moved closer to the console. A line of symbols scrolled across the central panel. Each one shifted as I watched, translating themselves into rough German. Solberg leaned in to read. "Contact established. Energy transfer successful. Biological integration pending." He swallowed, his expression tight. "This isn't just a machine. It's part of something alive." The second voice faded, leaving only the deeper one. Its final words were softer, almost a whisper. The lights dimmed and the chamber fell silent. I felt the hairs on my neck rise. We were standing in the last echo of a conversation between humans and something else, something that had once shared this place. Solberg exhaled slowly. "Now we have what we need." I nodded, though my hands were shaking. The evidence was here: recordings, symbols, the fragment itself. Enough to prove that the frozen gate was not myth. As I gathered the recorder, I glanced up at the dome ceiling. For an instant, I thought I saw a faint blue glow pulsing above us. But when I looked again, it was gone. We clipped our harnesses to the rope and began the climb out. The glyphs along the shaft pulsed softly, as if marking our passage. When I reached the surface, the cold slapped my face and I realized I had been sweating. Solberg joined me a moment later, his eyes bright despite the exhaustion. "No one will believe it," he said. "Until they see it for themselves." I looked back at the open hatch. The air that rose from it felt almost warm against my cheeks. "Then we show them," I said. The wind picked up, carrying snow across the basin. We packed our equipment in silence, knowing this was the moment we stepped beyond the threshold of return. We left the basin in a hurry, moving along the ridge before dawn returned. The crawler's engine vibrated beneath my seat, the noise a steady backdrop to my thoughts. My hands rested on the recorder in my lap, feeling the residual warmth where it had captured the voices. Each time I closed my eyes, I heard them again, layered, resonant, and inhuman. Solberg kept both hands on the wheel as he steered us along the shallow drift. He had said little since we climbed out of the chamber. I knew he was processing it in his own way, piecing together everything we had witnessed. The satellite uplink was still functional, but he refused to power it back on. We agreed it was safer to keep our signal dark as long as possible. Hours passed in a tense, uneasy quiet. The ridgeline fell behind us, replaced by a rolling expanse of ice. At noon, we stopped beside a field of fractured ridges to refuel. Solberg worked the pump while I checked the drone batteries and packed the recorder into a sealed case. The sky overhead was cloudless, an unbroken ceiling of pale blue that offered no shelter. As I zipped the pack closed, I heard a soft whine above. The wind, I looked up, my breath catching. A shape hovered far overhead, a dull metallic disk reflecting the glare of the sun. My mind tried to name it, but no explanation fit. It was too large, too silent, gliding without effort. "Peter," I said, my voice low and unsteady. He turned, following my gaze. The fuel nozzle slipped from his hand, clattering onto the ice. Neither of us moved as the craft descended, drifting closer until its surface filled half the sky. From beneath, I could see faint seams running along the hull, each one pulsing with a blue glow that matched the glyphs on the gate. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. The disk stopped moving, hovering no more than 50 meters above us. The air felt charged, as if a storm were about to break. Solberg stepped closer to me, his hand brushing my arm. "Stay calm," he whispered. A beam of blue light lanced down from the center of the craft, enveloping us in a column that shimmered against the ice. My skin prickled with heat, though the air remained cold. I tried to move, but my limbs felt heavy, as though the light had anchored me in place. For an instant, the world shifted. I saw not the ice, but a darkness threaded with stars. Shapes moved through it, silhouettes tall and angular. A sensation flooded my mind, alien and precise. It was not speech, but it carried intent. A feeling that we were being examined, measured. Then the vision vanished. The beam flickered out, and the craft began to rise again. Solberg sank to one knee, his breath ragged. I knelt beside him, placing my hand on his shoulder. His eyes were open but unfocused, as if he were seeing something far beyond this frozen place. "Peter," I said softly. His gaze found mine. "I saw them," he whispered. "They've been here longer than any of us," he swallowed, voice trembling. "I think they remember." My hands shook as I helped him stand. The disk rose higher, shrinking until it was a silver point against the sky. Then it vanished without a sound. For a long moment we stood there, staring at the empty air. My mind reeled. No recording could capture what had just happened. Number. Document could explain that feeling of being pulled beyond myself. When we finally moved again, it was in a daze. Solberg picked up the fuel nozzle and secured it to the tank. I climbed into the crawler and sat with my hands pressed flat against my knees, trying to steady my breathing. He joined me a moment later, his expression pale and resolute. "We can't keep this to ourselves," he said. I nodded. "They'll do everything to bury it. Then we have to be faster." He turned the ignition, and the crawler rumbled to life. As we rolled away from the ridges, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting the disk to reappear. The sky remained empty, but the feeling of being watched never left. That night, we camped in a sheltered hollow where the wind couldn't reach us. Solberg sat by the crawler, sketching the outlines of the craft in a notebook. I transcribed everything we had seen and felt, every detail that might be questioned later. The glow of my headlamp painted long shadows on the walls of the tent. I felt a tightness in my chest that would not ease. I knew this was only the beginning. If they had revealed themselves to us, it was for a reason. We were part of something far larger than any conspiracy or buried project. As I set down my pen, I looked at the sealed recorder on the pack. Its indicator light blinked steady and red, a heartbeat in the dark. We had the evidence, we had the story. And if we survived what came next, the world would know it too. We broke camp before first light. The cold was sharper than any morning before, a hard, brittle air that stung my skin through the layers of wool and synthetic fabric. Solberg packed the recorder and the notebooks while I scouted the ridge. From the highest point, I scanned the horizon with binoculars. A thin plume of snow drifted in the distance, moving faster than any natural wind. My stomach clenched. "They're coming," I called down. Solberg didn't need to ask who. He secured the last crate and climbed into the crawler. I slid behind the wheel and turned us east. The engine fired with a reluctant groan. As we accelerated across the flats, I risked a glance behind us. The plume was growing, a line of tracked vehicles moving with purpose. I realized with a cold certainty that the drone we destroyed must have transmitted our last known position before it died. GARC had triangulated our path by satellite, and now they were closing in. Solberg worked the satellite uplink, his gloved hands moving fast over the controls. "I'm transmitting everything," he said. "Even partial files are better than nothing." "Do it," I said. My voice was steady, but my heart was hammering. The crawler surged over a ridge, the treads churning through fresh snow. Ahead lay the Ghost Pass, a narrow canyon flanked by ice walls that rose nearly 50 meters. I had studied the maps enough to know it was our only chance to break line of sight. If we made it through, we could scatter our signal across multiple relays and disappear into the southern shelf. If we failed, we would be trapped in a natural cul-de-sac. Solberg finished the transmission and locked the console. "They know we have proof," he said. "They'll do whatever it takes to stop?" "U.S., then we don't let them," I replied. The pass loomed ahead, a ragged slit in the ice. I drove into its mouth, feeling the walls close around us. The crawler's engine echoed in the confined space. Frost shattered under our treads like breaking glass. The pass twisted left, then right, so tight in places I could have reached out and touched the walls. As we rounded the final curve, I slammed the brakes. A drone hovered in the middle of the canyon, its rotors humming in the still air. A single lens rotated to face us, pulsing red. Solberg's hand went to the transmitter switch, but I was already moving. I threw the crawler into reverse and backed into the curve, just as a burst of static crackled over the radio. A voice, cold and without accent, filled the cab. "Surrender your equipment and step outside. You will not be harmed." I cut the engine. The drone drifted closer. Its lens fixed on us like an unblinking eye. Solberg opened his door, but I grabbed his arm. "Wait," I whispered. My gaze darted across the canyon walls. A jagged overhang jutted above the drone, heavy with fractured ice. I slipped out of the crawler and moved along the wall, keeping low. The cold bit into my face, but I ignored it. Every step felt impossibly loud. The drone rotated, trying to track me. I reached the base of the overhang and studied the fractures. If I could break the largest one, it might bury the drone, long enough for us to get clear. I pulled the ice axe from my belt and drove it into the crack. The drone swung toward me, its rotors flaring brighter. Solberg shouted something, but I couldn't hear. I struck the crack again. A deep groan echoed through the canyon. The ice shifted overhead, the drone lifted higher, preparing to fire. I swung the axe one last time. A thunderous crack split the air as the overhang sheared away. The drone tried to ascend, but the avalanche struck it squarely. Chunks of ice exploded around me as I stumbled back. The impact buried the drone in a mound of debris. The lens flickered once, then went dark. Solberg was at my side, pulling me upright. "Go," I said. He nodded, and we ran for the crawler. I threw the transmission switch as soon as we were inside, flooding every frequency with the files. Solberg shifted into gear, and the crawler surged forward, climbing over the broken ice. The pass opened into a wide basin. As we emerged, I looked back. More drones were rising from behind the ridge, their silhouettes sharp against the dawn. The radio crackled again. The same voice returned, colder now. "You have chosen conflict. There will be no further warnings." Solberg drove hard across the basin. I watched the coordinates scroll across the nav screen. We were only 20 kilometers from the shelf's edge, where an extraction team was scheduled to meet us. If we reached it, there was a chance the evidence could be smuggled to the outside world. The crawler shuddered as we crossed a patch of deep powder. Behind us, the drones began to close the distance. A low roar reached my ears, and I turned to see two black transport vehicles cresting the ridge. Their lights swept the basin, searching. Solberg met my eyes, his jaw clenched. "They'll try to bury us here," he said. His voice was matter-of-fact, but I heard the finality in it. "Then we stay ahead of them," I said. I pressed the transmitter again, broadcasting our location and everything we had learned. The last transmission code blinked green on the console. If nothing else, someone out there knew where we were. The basin narrowed into a channel that cut toward the shelf. The crawler's treads bit into the ice, throwing up a spray of frozen shards. I watched the transports disappear behind a ridge, then reappear even closer. My breath came in short bursts. I knew we wouldn't outrun them forever. But as long as we moved, the story lived. And until the last moment, I would not let them. Erase it. The crawler roared across the narrowing channel, treads grinding over ice ridges that threatened to split the track plates. Solberg kept one hand on the throttle, the other gripping the nav console as it rattled in its mount. I braced my boots against the floor and watched the horizon, hoping for any sign of the shelf's edge. Each minute felt stolen. The black transports behind us moved in and out of sight as the channel twisted. I could almost feel their engines, rumbling over the ice like a storm we could not escape. A low chime sounded on the console. Solberg looked down. "We're approaching the signal?" "Beacon," he said. "If we can reach it, we can broadcast the files in one burst to multiple satellites." I nodded. My throat was too tight to speak. The ridge walls lowered as we advanced, opening into a wide depression between rolling drifts. In the center stood a steel mast anchored by heavy cables. An American flag hung limp in the still air, faded almost white by decades of sun and wind. Solberg eased the crawler to a stop. I climbed out first, boots crunching across the ice. My hands worked. The transmitter case free from its bracket. I didn't look back at the transports. I knew they were closing in. We crossed the basin to the mast. A hatch at its base gaped open, rimmed with frost. Solberg pulled a small lamp from his pack and swept the beam inside. Stairs descended into darkness. "It's an old high-jump station," he said. "They must have abandoned it after the mission ended." I felt the recorder in my coat, warm against my ribs. "If there are files down there, we take them." Solberg didn't argue. We climbed down one after the other. The air grew warmer as we descended, filled with the stale scent of oil and paper. At the bottom, the stairs opened into a low chamber lined with file cabinets. A rusted generator squatted. In the corner, its panel cracked open. I switched on my lamp and moved to the nearest cabinet. The drawers stuck, swollen with ice, but I forced them open. Inside were stacks of folders stamped in red: Operation Hajump, Restricted, Solberg. Joined me and tugged another drawer free. A cascade of paper slid onto the floor, edges brittle as old leaves. I knelt, scanning each page. They were mission logs, typed in clipped language. At first, the entries were mundane weather reports, equipment manifests. But deeper in the stack, the tone shifted. I read aloud, my voice sounding foreign in the still air. Encountered aerial object, silver in appearance, no visible markings. Formation held position above convoy. Instruments failed. Personnel reported nausea and disorientation. Solberg's lamp moved over another sheet. His breath caught. "Listen to this," he said, engaged by unidentified craft. "Losses sustained, 3 vehicles, 12 personnel. Orders to suppress incident. New directive issued, avoid contact, deny sightings." My pulse thudded in my ears. These were not rumors. They were official reports, hidden away for 70 years. I turned another page and found a transcript, the words blurred by water damage. The header read, "FTR Action Briefing, 2 March 1947. I wiped the page clean and read silently. The text was blunt. Entire teams vanished without a trace. Search parties found only scorched snow and scattered equipment. No survivors. I felt a hollowness open in my chest. This was the cost of secrets men sent to die for knowledge no one could admit existed. Solberg closed his eyes. "They knew," he whispered. "They knew and buried it." A muffled thud carried down the stairs. My lamp flickered. I stood, clutching the folder to my chest. Another thud sounded, closer this time. Solberg moved to the stairs and looked up. His face was pale. "They're here," he said. The finality in his voice told me there would be no more running. I shoved as many documents into my pack as it would hold. Solberg ripped out the generator's storage disk and slipped it into his coat. We met by the base of the stairs, eyes locked. "If they take us," he said, "you don't let them have this." He tapped the recorder at my side. "Promise me." I swallowed the fear rising in my throat. "I promise," a third thud. The walls vibrated with impact. I switched off my lamp. Darkness swallowed us. In that silence, I heard my grandfather's voice in memory, a faint echo repeating the same words he had written decades ago. They're not human. Solberg pressed a small device into my hand. A flare charge. His fingers squeezed mine for a moment, then released. The door at the top of the stairs exploded inward, a shaft of daylight piercing the dark. Shapes moved against the brightness, tall figures in black cold-weather suits, weapons raised. My breath caught. Solberg raised his hand slowly. I kept mine hidden in the folds of my coat, fingers tight around the flare trigger. The lead figure stepped forward, visor reflecting the weak light. The voice that came from the speaker was flat and precise. Surrender the materials. You have one chance. I didn't move. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. Solberg looked back at me, his eyes steady. I knew he was trusting me to make the choice. The figures advanced another step, weapons aimed. My thumb slid to the safety catch on the flare. I would not let them erase this truth. Not after so many had died to keep it alive. I didn't release. The flare. My thumb rested on the trigger, but my hand stayed steady. The lead figure stopped at the bottom of the stairs, visor glinting in the dim light. Behind him, two others held their weapons trained on us. For a moment, no one spoke. The air seemed to hold its breath. Then the figure lifted a gloved hand and touched the side of his helmet. The visor retracted with a soft hiss. A woman's face appeared, pale and sharp-boned, her eyes a pale gray that caught the lamplight. Her expression was not anger but calculation. "Ilara Nix," she said. Her voice was low, confident. "Director Annalise Kruger, Global Antarctic Research Consortium." My mouth was dry. "You've come a long way," I managed. Her gaze moved to Solberg, then back to me. "You've seen things you don't understand. You've taken material that does not belong to you." Solberg lifted his chin. "It belongs to the world." She tilted her head slightly. "Does it? Do you think humanity is ready for this? Knowledge, ready to confront what's under the ice?" I gripped the recorder inside my coat. My hand was shaking now. "It doesn't matter if they're ready," I said. "It's the truth." Kruger studied me in silence. I couldn't read her expression. At last, she nodded to one of the operatives. He stepped forward and opened a black case. Inside were two small tablets and a folded document sealed with a red wax emblem. She gestured to them. "This is your choice," she said. "You walk out of here with new identities and guaranteed immunity. All evidence will be destroyed and you will never speak of this again." My stomach twisted. "And if we refuse?" Kruger's voice did not change. "Then you will be classified as hostile actors. You know what that means." Solberg looked at me. His face was tight with exhaustion and pain, but there was no uncertainty in his eyes. I thought of everything we had seen, the frozen gate, the discs above the ice, the chamber of voices. I thought of Ingrid Falcon dying with the truth still clenched in her hands. My voice came out steady. "No deal." Kruger's gaze narrowed a fraction. "Consider carefully. You will not get another offer." I took a slow breath and looked. At Solberg, he gave the smallest nod. I lifted the recorder just enough for her to see it, my thumb brushing the activation switch. "We've already transmitted most of it," I said. "But if anything happens to us, the rest will go out. All of it." The room was so quiet I could hear my own pulse. Kruger's eyes did not move from mine. Slowly she exhaled. "You've made your position clear," she said. She gestured, and the operatives lowered their weapons a fraction. "You are free to go for now," Solberg frowned. "Why let us walk out?" Kruger's mouth curved in something that was almost a smile. "Because your transmission has caused more disruption than you realize. You have forced a reckoning that will take time to contain. And perhaps," she hesitated, her voice dropping almost to a whisper, "perhaps it is time some of this came to light." For a second the mask slipped, and I saw something behind her gaze fatigue, maybe even regret. Then it was gone. She nodded once. The operative stepped back, clearing a path to the stairs. I didn't wait. Solberg and I climbed up into the daylight. The cold hit me like a slap. I blinked in the sudden glare. Behind us, the GART team did not follow. The hatch closed with a final metallic clang. We stood in the wind, the documents pressed tight to our chests. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say. The basin around the mast was empty. The transports were gone, vanished as if they had never been. Only our crawler remained, half buried in drifted snow. Solberg moved first. He climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. I settled beside him, the recorder clutched in my lap. We pulled away from the mast in silence. As the ridge rose behind us, I turned for one last look. The steel mast stood tall against the empty sky, the tattered flag snapping in the wind. I wondered how many men had come here before us, thinking they could hide what they had seen. The crawler crawled over the ridge, the treads rattling on bare rock. Solberg glanced at me. His voice was quiet, but unshaken. "Where will you take it?" I didn't hesitate. "Everywhere," I said. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The wind rose, carrying snow across the ice in long white banners. In that moment, I knew we were past the point of no return. Whatever came next, denials, threats, revelations, we had done what we came to do. We had refused to be silenced. And in that refusal, we had already won something no one could ever take back. The wind grew stronger as we left the basin behind. Snow drifted across the crawler's windshield, clinging to the glass in swirling sheets. Solberg drove without speaking, his focus locked on the faint line of the horizon. I kept the recorder in my lap, my fingers tracing its edges like a talisman. Each mile felt heavier, weighted by the knowledge that every moment we remained on the ice was a risk we could no longer measure. After an hour, the landscape shifted. The ground dipped into a shallow valley, marked by old survey flags bleached almost white. According to the last coordinates, the installation lay at the far end, buried beneath a glacial shelf. The data we had intercepted from the abandoned Hijum station had referenced a lower level, a storage chamber no one had entered in decades. If the craft was truly down there, it would be the final proof no one could deny. Solberg eased the crawler to a stop beside a jagged outcrop, the engine idled in the cold. He looked at me, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. "If we go down there," he said, "we may not come back." My voice was calm, though I felt anything but calm. "Then we finish this now." He nodded once. We gathered the last of the gear, ropes, chemical lamps, a compact analog camera. The digital equipment was unreliable in extreme temperatures, and if the chamber contained an active field like the one near the frozen gate, any electronics might fail. I checked the flare charge still clipped to my belt. If everything else was destroyed, it would be the last means to signal anyone that we had made it this far. Solberg led the way across the valley. The snow grew deeper, swirling around our knees. At the far edge, the ice rose in a jagged wall that looked smooth from a distance, but up close was scarred by fractures and narrow vents. He stopped at a seam no wider than my shoulders. Heat pulsed out in waves, melting the snow around the opening. "This is it," he said quietly. I nodded. We secured the ropes to a piton and tested the anchor. Solberg went first, descending into the dark. I followed, each movement slow and deliberate. The warmth increased the farther we went. My goggles fogged and I pulled them off, blinking against the rising humidity. The shaft opened into a chamber so vast my headlamp could not touch the far walls. I felt the same pressure I had felt near the gate, a hum in my bones that made it hard to draw a full breath. Solberg swung his lamp in a wide arc. At the center of the floor stood a structure that filled the space. It was a disc-shaped craft. Encased in what looked like transparent alloy, the hull traced with the same blue glyphs we had seen on the surface. A single fracture ran across its side, as though something had struck it long ago. Steam rose through the cracks, condensing on the chamber ceiling and raining back in a soft mist. My throat tightened. This was no legend, no second-hand account. It was real, and we were standing in front of it. Solberg moved closer, his boots sending echoes across the floor. He pressed a gloved hand to the casing. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a pale glow spread under his palm, following the lines of the glyphs in a slow spiral. "It's still active," he said, voice hushed. I raised the camera and took a single photo. The shutter clicked, impossibly loud in the silence. I turned to look at the walls. Cables snaked away from the base of the craft, disappearing into conduits carved through the ice. A panel near the floor flickered with shifting symbols. I reached for the recorder and set it on the ice, pressing the activation button. The indicator. Light glowed steady red, proof. Solberg circled the hull, examining the fracture. He lifted his lamp to the edge of the crack. "This break isn't from storage damage," he murmured. "It looks deliberate, like they tried to disable it." I thought of the men who had sealed this place. Perhaps they had decided no one should ever see what they had found. My lamp flickered. A tremor passed under my boots. For a second, I thought it was only my imagination. Then the tremor came again, stronger. The air pressure dropped, making my ears pop. A hum rose from the craft, a resonance that climbed in pitch until it pressed against my teeth. I staggered back. Solberg looked at me, his face pale. "It's powering up." The glow inside the fracture brightened. Light poured from the seams in thin, blinding lines. My headlamp sputtered and died. In the sudden dark, the only illumination came from the craft itself. The hum deepened to a steady, rhythmic pulse that felt like a heartbeat. I fumbled for the flare, my hands numb. "We have to record this," I said. My voice sounded thin in my ears. Solberg turned, pulling the analog camera from his pack. He raised it just as the craft emitted a single, resonant tone. The floor shook. A wave of heat blasted outward, sending me sprawling. I clutched the recorder to my chest. A final pulse of blue light flared across the chamber, then vanished. The hum ceased. Silence returned, deeper than before. I forced myself to stand. The craft lay still, dark again, but something had changed. The glyphs remained dimly lit, as if waiting for a response. Solberg lowered the camera, his face lined with awe. "We have it," he whispered. "Even if they kill us, they can't bury this." I nodded, my heart still pounded. In that moment, I felt no fear, only certainty. Whatever lay beneath the ice, it was awake now, and the world would have to reckon with it. The silence after the pulse felt oppressive. My ears rang with the echo of the craft's tone. I stood frozen, one hand pressed to the recorder against my chest. Solberg exhaled slowly and lowered the analog camera. The faint glow along the hull flickered, but did not die. It pulsed at intervals, as if measuring the space around it. A low hum continued, almost beneath hearing. I forced myself to move, feeling each step as if I were walking through water. My boots scraped the damp ice. "We have to get this out now," I said. My voice was steady, but my chest felt tight. Solberg nodded. "The signal will be strongest from the ridge. If we can reach the crawler and power the uplink, we can send everything in one burst." I picked up the recorder and slipped it into the padded compartment of my pack. As I cinched the straps, the glow brightened again, casting elongated shadows. Along the walls, my pulse beat hard against my ribs. I knew without asking that the craft was not finished. This was only the beginning of whatever sequence had been set in motion. Solberg took one last look at the fracture. He touched the casing, lightly as if to say farewell. Then he turned toward the rope. I followed him to the shaft. My hand closed around the last flare charge. I knew if we were cornered, it might be the only way to alert someone to our position. The climb felt longer than before. My arms burned with the effort. The air cooled as we rose, the warmth of the chamber falling away. When I finally pulled myself onto the surface, the wind struck my face, sharp and bracing. Solberg climbed out behind me and scanned the horizon. The sky had deepened to gray, the sun hidden behind a wall of cloud. The crawler sat half buried. Where we left it, a thin rime of frost glazing the windshield. No tracks marred the snow around it. I allowed myself one breath of relief. Solberg didn't pause. He pulled open the side panel and began priming the power cells. I climbed into the passenger seat and powered on the uplink console. The screen flickered, lines of text scrolling past in rapid succession. "Signal strength is variable," I said. "We'll have one chance." He didn't look up. "Then we don't waste it." I inserted the recorder's data cable into the console input. The files loaded in silence. Video clips, audio logs, scanned blueprints. The last folder was labeled Final and Archive of everything we had seen, including the raw footage of the chamber and the craft's activation. Solberg keyed in the distribution list. Names and addresses scrolled across the display. News outlets, research collectives, private contacts. My fingers hovered over the final confirmation. I thought of my grandfather's journal, decoded. Telegram, the decades of buried evidence. I thought of Ingrid Falcon, her eyes tired but defiant. All of them had passed the same burden forward. Now it was ours to release. "Ready?" I said. Solberg placed one hand on my shoulder. "Do it!" I pressed transmit. The uplink antenna rotated with a mechanical whine. A soft pulse of static filled the cabin as the system locked onto the nearest relay. The screen flashed green. Files. Sending. For a few seconds I couldn't breathe. Each tick of the progress bar felt like a lifetime. Outside, the wind shifted, and I glimpsed movement along the ridge. My stomach clenched. Black shapes moved through the drifting snow, three figures in insulated suits, weapons slung across their chests. "They're here," I whispered. Solberg followed my gaze. His face remained composed, but his jaw tightened. He reached for the analog camera and slipped it inside his coat. "Keep the transmission going as long as you can," he said. He unlatched the driver's side door and stepped onto the ice, raising both hands in a slow, deliberate gesture. The figures advanced without speaking. I didn't recognize any insignia on their suits. Their visors were opaque, reflecting the pale sky. The console chimed sending. 68%. I gripped the edge of the panel so hard my knuckles ached. My thoughts narrowed to a single point. Even if they killed us here, the files had to finish transmitting. One of the figures gestured at Solberg to step aside. He obeyed, moving slowly. Another figure approached my door and raised one hand, palm out. I realized it was a signal to exit the vehicle. I didn't move. My eyes locked on the console, 79%, 82%. The figure opened the door and leaned inside. A voice crackled through the helmet speaker, distorted by static. "Step out now." My hand crept to the flare charge at my belt. My thumb found the safety catch. The figure repeated the command, voice sharper. I didn't look away from the screen, 91%. My heart hammered so loud I felt it in my temples. "You don't understand," I said, my voice low. "It's too late." The console flashed transmission complete. For an instant, time seemed to hold still. My breath caught in my throat as if I had forgotten how to draw air. I felt the weight lift from my chest, replaced by a cold, bright certainty that was sharper than any fear. Solberg turned his head toward me, his eyes shining with something I had never seen there before. Peace. The hum of the uplink faded into silence. Outside, the operatives shifted in the snow, their weapons lowering as if they sensed it too. Whatever leverage they thought they held was already gone. We had done it. Even if the cold swallowed us or the guns roared, the truth had left this place. The figure reached for me. I snapped the flare free and pulled the pin. A burst of red light erupted in my hand, blinding in the gray daylight. I threw it into the snow at the figure's feet. Solberg lunged forward, using the distraction to shove the nearest operative away. I leapt from the crawler, my boots sinking, into drifted powder. As the flare hissed, I turned and met Solberg's eyes across the chaos. We both knew we might not survive the next minute. But in that instant I felt no fear, only the fierce relief that we had already won. The flare burned bright in the snow, casting long red shadows across the ice. The operatives staggered back, momentarily blinded. Solberg reached me first, grabbing my arm and pulling me behind the crawler. His breath came fast, white vapor billowing in the cold. I felt the recorder in my pocket, the edges pressing into my ribs. It was the last copy of everything that mattered. The figures regrouped beyond the flare. One raised a hand, giving a clipped signal I didn't recognize. The others shifted formation, fanning out along the ridge. I knew it wouldn't be long before they circled behind us. Solberg pulled his coat tighter around his chest and met my eyes. "We can't hold them here," he said. His voice was calm, but there was no doubt in it. They won't leave witnesses. I swallowed the tightness in my throat. Then, we make sure it doesn't matter. I tapped the recorder with my gloved fingers. The files are out. Even if they bury us, they can't bury that? He gave the faintest nod. The wind gusted, carrying the last embers of the flare into darkness. For a heartbeat, everything stilled. No movement, no voices. Then a voice called from the ridge, amplified by a cum unit. "Stand down, you are surrounded." Solberg shifted his weight. His hand brushed mine, a silent promise that we wouldn't surrender. I felt my pulse steady. I realized I had never been more certain of anything. A beam of white light swept across us, dazzling in the gloom. I turned my face away, blinking hard. Solberg leaned close, his words low and sure. "Run when I give the word. I won't leave you," I said. "You will?" he insisted. Another shout echoed. "You have 10 seconds. He pressed the analog camera into my hand. "Take this, it's proof. Get it to someone who will listen." I wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped me. He had made peace with what came next. I nodded, my throat tight. The operatives advanced in a line, weapons raised. Solberg stepped out from behind the crawler, moving with the quiet, deliberate grace of a man who had already chosen his fate. He lifted his hands slowly, palms out, as if to show he carried nothing but the truth. His breath curled in pale clouds that drifted past his face. "You want me," he called, his voice carrying clear and unbroken across the ice. "I'm the one who transmitted the files? Let her go?" He didn't look back at me. He knew if he did, neither of us would be able to turn away. His voice was clear, carried across the ice without a tremor. The figures paused. For a moment, no one moved. Then I felt his hand press the small device into my palm-a-second flare charge, primed but unlit. He didn't look back. I understood. This was the only way to buy me time. I slipped around the crawler's rear axle, boots sinking into a drift. My body felt numb, but my mind was sharp. Every movement etched itself into memory. Solberg walked toward the figures, his shoulders square. The lead operative lowered his weapon by a fraction. "Don't be foolish," he called. "There's no place to go." Solberg didn't answer. He reached inside his coat and pulled out the empty recorder case. He held it high so they could. "See, it's finished," he said. His voice carried a fierce finality. "You lost." The operative stepped forward. The others fanned out behind him. In that moment I slipped away, moving along the edge of the ridge. My feet found a narrow ledge carved by wind and time. I kept my body low, one hand gripping the frozen rock. The cold bit into my skin, but I welcomed it. It kept me awake, focused dot behind. "Me," Solberg's voice rose, steadier than I had ever heard it. "Remember us," he said. For a single heartbeat, no one moved. The wind fell silent. The world seemed to narrow to the sound of his breath and the memory of every step that brought. "Usir." Then a single shot cracked across the basin, sharp as breaking glass. My body flinched, but I kept moving. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My legs carried me up the ridge, each step a surge of pain that made my vision blur. The wind rose. Around me in a steady howl, scouring my face raw and erasing any tracks I left behind. I dug my boots into the crusted snow, feeling the cold seep through the seams in my clothing. My breath came in ragged bursts, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Every meter I gained was one more Solberg had given me. When I reached the top, I risked one glance over my shoulder. The crawler was a dark shape against the snow. The operatives clustered near it, weapons lowered. Solberg was gone. I pressed my fist to my mouth, forcing the grief down. There was no time for it, not yet. I turned and moved east, away from the valley. Each step felt impossible, but I took it anyway. The analog camera hung heavy against my chest. I knew what it meant. Proof no one could dismiss. Proof that would outlast any cover story. As the hours passed, the horizon brightened. Dawn broke in pale ribbons across the ice. I climbed another ridge, legs trembling with exhaustion. At the summit, I stopped. The frozen gate lay below, ringed in blue light that pulsed in a slow rhythm. Even from this distance, I could see the glyphs shining. It was still active, waiting. A reminder that some truths could never be buried forever. I raised the camera and took one last photo. The shutter clicked, a small sound swallowed by the wind. As I lowered it, I felt something shift inside me. A quiet certainty that no matter what happened, the story had already escaped. They could silence voices, erase names, but not the evidence. Not the knowledge that the world was stranger and more extraordinary than anyone dared believe. I turned east, toward the place where the first supply routes cut across the ice in parallel lines. Somewhere beyond those ridges, there would be a radio or a signal flare I could use. My body was weak, each step sending a dull ache through my knees, but my purpose held steady. I pressed one hand to the recorder inside my coat, feeling its edges solid and real against my ribs. I walked into the rising light, each step carrying me farther from the silence that had hidden the truth and closer to the moment it would finally be heard. Behind me, the frozen gate glowed in the dawn, silent and eternal, promising that the story was far from over. They found Peterson in the clearing just after 0400 hours, standing motionless in the frost, one hand pressed flat against the scorched earth. His lips moved, but no words came out, only a slow exhale that fogged the air between us. I watched. From the edge of the trees, radio clutched to my chest, the static pulsing against my palm like a dying heartbeat. He didn't look up when the medics arrived. He didn't blink. And when they finally pulled his hand free, I saw the shape burned into the ground beneath his palmous circle of interlocking triangles. Precise as a brand, that was the first moment I realized none of us were prepared for. What had come down in Rendlesham Forest? I'd been on patrol less than an hour before the first call came over the radio. A voice I didn't recognize, ragged with panic. It's here, it's landed, oh God, it's real. The signal fractured into static, then snapped back, repeating the same coordinates over and over. I copied them onto my clipboard with hands. I couldn't keep steady, they told us later. It was a training drill, a misidentified aircraft, a weather anomaly, anything but what we'd all heard. But I remember the frequency slipping into a rhythm I'd never heard in any comms exercise, a binary sequence, repeating in precise intervals like a beacon dot. By the time I reached the command post, the first response team had returned. They looked like men who'd walked through something that had no place in our world. Wilcox sat hunched on the bumper of the Jeep, face in his hands, whispering to himself. One of the corporals leaned against the doorframe, eyes wide and unseeing. The air around them felt brittle, charged. That was when the man in the dark overcoat arrived. No insignia, no rank. Just an expression I couldn't read, and a voice that carried across the gravel lot without needing to rise above a whisper. He walked straight to Wilcox, bent low, and spoke 3 words I'll never forget. You saw nothing. Then he straightened, turned to the rest of us, and scanned our faces like he was memorizing every detail. For a long moment, no one moved. No one dared to speak. And in that silence, I understood that whatever we'd witnessed wasn't just being hidden, it was being erased. The official report listed a brief communications failure. No sightings, no evidence recovered. But I was there when they unloaded Peterson from the transport, strapped to a gurney, his eyes still fixed on something only he could see. I caught a glimpse of the clipboard clutched to his chest. Under the clear plastic cover was a sheet of paper covered in neat rows of ones and zeros. Binary. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the clearing. The frost shimmering around the imprint in the soil. The hush that settled over the men when they realized no one would ever believe them. I knew I should let it go. Sign the paperwork. Swallow the story and pretend none of it had happened. But some part of me refused. Maybe it was the shape burned into the ground, or the way Peterson had pressed his hand to it as if it had spoken to him. Maybe it was the cadence of that binary sequence, ticking through my thoughts like a metronome. I lay in my bunk until dawn, listening to the wind rattle the tin siding on the barracks. And I decided that if no one else would remember, I would. Even if it meant tearing apart everything I thought I knew about this place, about the chain of command, about the world itself. When the sun finally rose, I dressed and walked back out into the forest. The clearing was already cordoned off, posted with temporary fencing and armed guards. But as I stood there at the edge of the trees, watching the frost melt around the empty space, I knew I would come back, because whatever came down that night had left something behind, something more than scorched earth and shattered nerves. A signal, a mark, a message no one wanted to hear, and I was already listening. I waited 3 nights before I slipped back past the perimeter. No one saw me leave the barracks. No one questioned why I signed out a jeep at 0200 hours. Maybe they were too tired to care, or maybe they already knew I was past the point of caution. The forest looked different in the dark. Every tree stood like a witness, brittle and silent. I kept the headlights off and let the engine idle under the branches. The wind carried the same metallic tang I'd tasted the night the craft came down. I tried to tell myself it was just diesel fumes or the cold, but I knew better. When I reached the clearing, the fencing was gone. No sign of the guards, no markers in the soil, just a blackened circle where nothing had grown back. I stepped over the edge and crouched to run my hand across the ground. The frost was thinner here, as if the earth still held a memory of heat. My fingers brushed against something sharp and edge where there shouldn't have been one. I pulled the object free and held it up to the moonlight. A metallic shard, no longer than my thumb, its surface etched with lines so fine I thought they might vanish if I blinked. But they didn't. The marks were real, precise, and somehow familiar. I traced one of the symbols, feeling the way it caught under my skin. The moment I touched it, a pressure bloomed behind my eyes, like the memory of a headache that hadn't happened yet. My vision flickered. Just for an instant, I thought I saw shapes moving at the tree line. But when I looked again, the forest was empty. I pocketed the shard and stood there listening. The clearing felt alive in a way I couldn't name. Not hostile, just aware, watching me the way I was watching it. By the time I made it back to base, dawn was breaking over the hangars. I hid the shard inside my footlocker under a false panel I'd built to stash contraband vodka. I thought it would be safe there. That night I went to see Sergeant Peterson. He'd been confined to a private room in the medical wing. No visitors allowed, but I still had the clearance code from my last patrol rotation. No one stopped me. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I stepped inside. He sat propped against the pillows, hands folded neatly on the blanket. For a long moment, he didn't look up. I cleared my throat and set my radio on the table between us. "You remember me?" I asked. He turned his head by degrees, like the motion required effort. His eyes focused slowly, recognition dawning in some far-off place behind them. "You were there," he said, voice hoarse. "You heard it too," I nodded. "I need you to tell me what happened." Peterson's gaze shifted to the corner of the room, as if he could still see the clearing behind my shoulder. He swallowed, the tendons in his neck standing out like cables. "I touched it," he whispered. "I thought it would be cold. But it wasn't. What did it feel like?" "Alive." His eyes flicked back to mine. It moved under my hand. "Like it was breathing," he trailed off. For a moment, I thought he'd drifted back into whatever fugue had swallowed him since that night. Then he drew a slow breath. "It showed me things," he said. "I don't know how. Visions like memories that weren't mine." "What kind of visions?" "Places, structures, sky full of shapes I couldn't name, and something else." He stopped. His pupils contracted sharply, as if he were trying to focus on something only he could see. "Binary," he rasped. "The code. It was in my head. I couldn't make it stop." I leaned closer. "What did it say?" Before he could answer, the door behind me creaked open. A cold draft swept across the room. 2 men stepped inside. No insignia, no rank. Just black uniforms pressed perfect. They didn't acknowledge me, didn't even look my way. One of them rested a hand on Peterson's shoulder. "That's enough," he said softly. Peterson didn't resist. His eyes slid shut, the last glimmer of awareness receding like a tide. I took a step back, but the second man lifted his chin toward me. "Time for you to go, Erman." I glanced at Peterson, but he didn't move. The shard in my pocket felt heavier than it had in the clearing. I slipped past them into the hall. My heart was hammering so loud I thought they must hear it. But they didn't follow. Didn't call me back. As I walked toward the exit, I looked over my shoulder just once. Through the half-closed door, I saw one of the men lean close to Peterson, whisper something I couldn't hear. And for the first time since the night it landed, I felt the certainty that whatever we had encountered wasn't just an unknown aircraft or foreign technology. It was something older. Something that had waited for someone to touch it. I didn't sleep at all when I returned to my quarters. I lay there replaying his words, the look in his eyes when he said the craft was alive. And the way those men had moved calm, efficient, as if they had rehearsed this 100 times before. That was the moment I understood the truth. We weren't just dealing with something extraordinary. We were dealing with people who already knew, and they would do anything to keep it from becoming real. They summoned me before dawn. An orderly knocked once, hard enough to rattle the door, then slid a sealed envelope under the threshold. I didn't need to open it to know what it meant. The only messages delivered this way were orders that couldn't be recorded in the normal logs. I, dressed without thinking, uniform crisp, boots laced tight. My hands worked by rote while my mind replayed Peterson's last words over and over. The code, the visions. The way he said alive, the envelope contained a time, a room number, and nothing else. No explanation. No signature. Just the sense that whatever waited on the other side of that door would change everything. I walked across the tarmac as the first light split the horizon. The hangars were shadows against the frozen sky. For a moment, I thought about turning back, pretending I'd never found the shard, never spoken to Peterson, never felt the gravity of that clearing pressing against my ribs. But I kept moving. Because I already knew there was no undoing it. The room was buried 2 levels below the main administration building. Concrete walls, no windows, the air so dry it scraped the back of my throat. A single steel table dominated the center, surrounded by chairs that didn't look like they'd ever been used. 2 men were waiting. One sat with his hands folded neatly in front of him, sleeves rolled to the elbow, exposing a pale ring of skin where a watch had been removed. The other stood by. The far wall, arms crossed over his chest. Neither wore a name tag. Sit down, Airman. The one at the table didn't look up from the folder in front of him as he spoke. I lowered myself into the chair across from him, conscious of the way the legs scraped the floor. The sound felt too loud that he turned a page, studied it for a moment, then closed the folder with a precise motion. When he finally lifted his gaze to mine, there was nothing in his expression. No curiosity, no hostility, just the tired efficiency of a man who had done this too many times. You were seen in the woods, he said. Early this morning. I didn't deny it. Found something you shouldn't have. I stayed silent. My heart ticked in my chest, counting the seconds until I'd have to answer. You spoke to Peterson. A muscle in his jaw shifted. The only sign he was less composed than he appeared. He's not well. I wanted to say I knew that I'd seen it in his eyes. But the words wouldn't form. The man sighed. He drew a single sheet of paper from the folder and slid it across the table. At the top, a bold heading, Non-Disclosure Agreement Classified Operations. Below it, lines for my signature, my serial number, the date. You understand what this is. He said. I nodded. If you refuse to sign, you will be remanded to a secure holding facility pending further disposition. If you sign, you will be restricted from discussing any aspect of the events of December 26th. You will not record, transmit, or otherwise preserve any related information. Violation will result in immediate court-martial under Article 92. His tone never changed, flat, impersonal, like he was reading a weather forecast. My throat felt raw when I finally spoke. What landed out there, he didn't blink. Foreign. Adversary technology. That's not an answer. Airman, this is not a conversation, he gestured to the paper. The second man by the wall shifted slightly, just enough to remind me he was there. I looked down at the form. My name already, typed at the top. A blank space waiting to be filled. Who are you? I asked. For the first time, the man smiled, small, humorless. You don't have clearance for that. His cuff slipped back when he reached for the folder. just enough for me to see what was inked into the inside of his wrist. A symbol. 3. Interlocking triangles. I felt my breath catch because I'd seen that shape before, burned into the clearing where Peterson had stood with his hand pressed to the earth. He noticed where I was looking, pulled the sleeve down in a single practiced motion. Sign. I picked up the pen. My hand hovered over the paper. Somewhere behind me, a fluorescent bulb hummed and clicked. My pulse kept time with it. I pressed the pen to the line and stopped. What does the code mean? I said quietly. His expression didn't change. But the second man pushed off the wall, took one deliberate step closer. It's nothing, the seated man said. Random noise. Peterson said it showed him something, his eyes fixed on mine. For a moment I thought he might say more, that some small scrap of honesty would slip free, but all he did was tap the line again with a single finger. Sign? I lowered the pen. My signature came out steady, each letter deliberate. When I finished, he retrieved the page and placed it back in the folder. You will return to your quarters. You will not discuss this meeting. You will resume your duties as scheduled. He closed the folder. If you deviate, he said, we will know. I stood. My legs felt unsteady, but I kept my face neutral. The second man watched me without blinking. At the door. I turned back once. That insignia, I said. What is it? The seated man didn't look up. Go home, airman. I walked out into the corridor. The door closed behind me with a final click that echoed down the hall, and in that moment, any illusion that this was just about military secrets fell away. It wasn't the Soviets. It wasn't some rival program or clandestine experiment. It was something older. Something hidden in plain sight. A group that didn't exist on any organizational chart, whose authority came from somewhere far beyond the Pentagon. And for the first time, I understood that I wasn't a witness, I was a liability. I returned to my quarters before dawn. The air inside felt stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in days. I sat on the edge of the bunk, boots still on, and listened to the quiet hum of the bass coming awake beyond the walls. Every instinct told me to lock the door, destroy the shard, forget the binary code. To pretend I hadn't seen the triangles on that man's wrist or the look in Peterson's eyes. But the certainty had already rooted itself too deep to be torn out. If I did nothing, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering what I'd turned my back on. I pulled the shard from the hidden compartment in my footlocker. Even in the half-light, its etched symbols seemed to shimmer as if they were never meant to be fixed in place. I turned it over in my hand, and that same pressure bloomed behind my eyes, a reminder of the clearing, the cold, the way the ground had felt alive. I wrapped it in an oilcloth and slipped it into my breast pocket. I knew where I had to start. By midday, I was standing outside the radar facility on the western edge of the base. The building was little more than a squat concrete block with a dish array on the roof. Officially, it handled routine flight tracking and weather telemetry. But everyone knew it had a second purpose, monitoring intercepts that never appeared in any declassified logs. I signed in under a routine maintenance pretext and found the man I was looking for. Hammond, a radar tech with 3 years in and a reputation for knowing when to look the other way. He didn't flinch when I stepped into the server room. Just glanced up from the terminal, his expression unreadable. You hear about the incident? I asked. He studied me for a beat before answering. Which one? The one that never happened. His gaze shifted to the doorway behind me, then back to my face. You shouldn't be here, he said quietly. I need the intercept logs from December 26th. He shook his head. They're sealed. Top clearance. You have a copy. He didn't deny it. For a moment, the only sound was the soft click of the tape drive cycling in the rack behind us. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small CSSETTE, held it between 2 fingers as if testing whether I understood the risk. I never gave this to you, he murmured. I closed my hand around it. When I stepped back into the corridor, I felt the tension I hadn't noticed until that moment, like a vice loosening from my ribs, but it didn't last. Because as I turned toward the exit, I caught the faintest reflection of movement on the polished floor of someone watching from the far end of the hall, just beyond the edge of the fluorescent light. I didn't look back again. Back in my quarters, I loaded the cassette into my portable player, locked the door, and pressed play. Static flooded the headphones, punctuated by bursts of compressed data. Then the voices came fragments of radio. Traffic, clipped and distorted, object descending. Coordinates locked. Binary transmission, repeat, binary transmission. I replayed the section again, isolating the pulse. Each burst was the same length, the same rhythm. A code. I began transcribing by hand, line after line of ones and zeros filling the page. It felt like a compulsion. My hand ached, but I couldn't stop. When the final sequence trailed into silence, I sat back and stared at the columns. Each fragment a piece of something that felt impossibly old, as if it had been waiting for centuries to be understood. I cross-referenced the pattern against the cryptography manuals I'd stolen from the operations library 2 years before. Nothing matched. But when I laid the printout beside the symbols etched into the shard, I felt my chest tighten. They weren't identical. But the rhythm, the spacing, it was the same language. Someone knocked. 3 short raps against the door. My breath caught. I tucked the printout under the mattress, slipped the shard into my boot, and forced my expression blank. When I opened the door, no one was there. Only an envelope resting against the threshold, inside a single sheet of paper. No letterhead. No seal. You are being watched. No signature. No need for one. I folded the page and placed it beside the cassette. My heart was steady in a way that felt almost separate from me, like it belonged to someone else, because whoever left that message didn't intend to scare me into silence. They wanted me to know they were close enough to reach me any time they chose, but they hadn't come through the door. Not yet. That night, I lay awake in my bunk, the shard pressing against my ankle. My mind turned over the symbols, the code, the names of places I hadn't spoken aloud. Peterson said it showed him things. I wondered if the same was waiting for me, and if it did, whether I'd ever be able to unsee it. I didn't leave my quarters for 2 days. I ate from ration packs, kept the lights low, and listened to every footstep in the hall. The shard never left my boot. Every time I tried to close my eyes, I saw that phrase printed in block letters, "You are being watched," but the code was worse. It kept unraveling in my mind, line after line of ones and zeros bleeding into symbols I couldn't read. I told myself I'd wait for an opportunity, some sign it was safe to move. But in the end, I went back out because I couldn't stand the idea that the answers were already slipping away. On the 3rd night, I signed out a Jeep and drove to the Cums Annex, an older structure near the south fence line. Officially, it was used to monitor civilian radio traffic. Unofficially, it was where they archived intercept logs that didn't fit any known signatures. I knew who to look for. Yates had been a signal specialist for nearly a decade. He didn't care who was in charge as long as he could keep his private archive of anomalies. I found him in the records room, hunched over a reel-to-reel deck, headphones clamped tight against his ears. He looked up when I stepped into the doorway. His eyes flicked to the insignia on my jacket, then to my face. "Didn't think you were the curious type," he said. I closed the door behind me. "I need you to help me decode something." He hesitated. "I don't get involved in whatever this is." "You already are." I set the cassette on the table between us. He didn't touch it. Just studied me like he was deciding whether I'd lost my mind. "Where'd you get that? Does it matter?" He sighed, reached for the reel-to-reel controls, and killed the playback. The sudden silence felt like it swallowed half the oxygen in the room. "Play it," he said. I did. He listened without speaking, only raising his eyebrows slightly when the binary transmission started. When it ended, he pulled the headphones off and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "You know what this is?" "Not exactly. It's not random. That's structured data, very old protocols. Some of this matches intercepts from the 60s. Project logs that never went public." "What kind of logs?" Yates's expression flattened. "Contact attempts? Patterns they traced to sites all over the world. Half the old records are redacted. But I've seen enough to know when something's deliberate." He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. "You're in over your head." "Help me," I said. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he reached into a file cabinet and withdrew a slim folder, its edges worn smooth. He flipped. It opened and spread out a series of blurry photocopies pages of typed reports, diagrams, hand-drawn maps. At the center was a coordinate grid. I felt something clench in my gut. Yates tapped one of the numbers. December 26th, he said. Rendlesham Forest. That's not an accident. What is it? Part of a larger pattern. These same coordinates appeared in intercepts going back decades. Sometimes the transmissions were different variations on the same code, but always the same sites. Greece, Turkey, the Sahara, places older than recorded history. He flipped to the next page. A grainy photo of an excavation site, stone pillars etched with symbols that looked too familiar. 3 interlocking triangles. My mouth was dry. Who else knows about this? People you don't want to meet, he said softly. He reached for one last document. An old memo stamped with an agency seal I didn't recognize. It was written in a clipped bureaucratic tone, but one phrase was underlined in red. Contact initiative to be denied at all CAS. Yates folded the papers back into the folder and slid it across the table. I shouldn't be giving you this, he said. You didn't get it from me. I tucked it inside my jacket, feeling the edges press against my ribs. As I turned to leave, he spoke again, his voice low. Be careful. Once you start seeing the connections, you can't go back. I didn't answer. Outside, the cold hit me like a slap. My breath hung in the air, pale and ragged. I walked to the Jeep and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. I opened the folder again and traced my finger along the coordinate list. My hand shook when I reached the final line. 372353. N. 251646. Idilos, a forgotten island in the Aegean. The same place Peterson described between fits of confusion. The same coordinates encoded in the binary signal. It wasn't random. It was a map. And for the first time, I realized that whatever came down in that clearing wasn't the first attempt. It was one of many, each buried under decades of silence. I looked out across the darkened airfield. Somewhere in the distance, a light flickered behind the windows of the main operations building. I knew if I went back there, they'd be waiting. I started the engine anyway, because no matter what it cost me, I had to know what was waiting on that island, and whether anyone else had already heard the signal. I didn't go back to my quarters. Instead, I drove to the far edge of the base and parked in a shallow depression where the security floodlights didn't reach. I shut off the ignition and waited, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. My heartbeat felt like it belonged to someone else, steady, detached. I knew I'd crossed the line. The moment I took that folder from Yates, I became something more than a witness. I became a liability. I pulled the map from my jacket and laid it across the dash. The coordinates stared back at me. Delos, a sight I hadn't thought about since my training rotation on Mediterranean deployments. The briefing materials had described it as an archaeological reserve, ancient ruins, protected heritage. But now I saw it for what it was. Another piece of the pattern no one wanted named. I traced the symbols along the margin of the page. The same triangles I'd seen on the man's wrist in the briefing room. The same design Peterson described in his visions. Every step I took, the circle closed tighter. I didn't hear the vehicle approach. I caught the first glint of headlights in the rear-view mirror low, deliberate, without any urgency. A black utility truck rolled to a stop behind me, engine idling. For a moment, no one moved. Then both front doors opened in unison. 2 silhouettes stepped into the beam of the headlights. No insignia, no visible weapons. Just the same black uniforms I'd seen in the medical wing. I folded the map and slipped it under my seat. My hand closed around the shard in my pocket, feeling the etched metal bite against my palm. The first man approached my window and rapped on the glass with the flat of his hand. "Step out," he said. His voice was calm, almost conversational. I considered trying to drive past them, slamming the Jeep into gear and barreling across the frost-brittle grass. But the second man was already moving to flank the passenger side. They weren't worried. They knew exactly how this would end. I opened the door and stepped down into the headlights. The cold hit my face in a rush. "You've been busy," the first man said. I didn't respond. "You think you're the first to find these connections?" He gestured vaguely toward the hidden folder. You think no one's tried to make this public? His tone didn't rise. He didn't need it to. Where is it? He asked. I kept my hands visible. Where's what? The evidence. I met his eyes. In that moment, something inside me settled into place, a clarity I hadn't expected. I don't have it, I lied. He studied me. A slow exhale fogged in the cold between us. You're making this harder than it needs to be. He said. Behind him, the second man opened the passenger door and began searching the cab methodical. Unhurried, I felt the shard against my leg, and for a moment I thought about reaching for it. I don't know what I intended to do. Prove it was real? Force them to acknowledge what they were trying to bury? But my hand stayed at my side. The second man straightened, a small cassette held between his thumb and forefinger. The intercept. Recording. Got it, he said. The first man didn't look away from me. You're going to come with us, he said quietly. I shook my head. No, I said. He tilted his head as if studying something just beyond my shoulder. Then he sighed and stepped closer, his boots crunching in the frost. That's unfortunate. I felt the moment break, the last thread of civility snapping. I turned and ran. The world narrowed to the sound of my own breath and the ragged thud of my boots on frozen ground. I heard them behind me, steady and confident, never hurrying. The tree line was only 50 yards away, but it felt like a mile. I didn't look back. Every instinct screamed to keep moving, to put anything between us trees, darkness, time. I reached the first row of pines and plunged into the shadows. Branches clawed at my uniform, tore the skin on my knuckles. I stumbled over roots, caught. Myself kept running. Somewhere behind me, I heard a voice calling out flat and emotionless. You can't outrun this. I didn't answer. I ran deeper until the headlights were swallowed by the darkness. My breath came in ragged bursts. The shard pressed hot against my skin, as if it had been waiting for this moment. When I finally stopped, the base was a memory behind me. I crouched in the hollow of an old oak, hands shaking, trying to catch my breath. They had the recording. They probably knew about the map. But they hadn't found the shard. That thought steadied me, even as the cold began to seep through my uniform, because it meant one thing: I still had a piece of the truth, and if they wanted it, they'd have to find me first. I didn't sleep that night. I waited in the hollow of the oak until dawn turned the sky a pale, indifferent gray. Every hour I listened for the sounds of boots in the leaves, radios crackling in the dark. But no one came. By sunrise, I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. Whatever network those men worked for, they didn't need to find me right away. They could afford to wait. Let exhaustion and paranoia finish what their threats had started, but I wasn't ready to give up the last fragments of what I'd seen. Not when I finally understood the scale of what was buried beneath the official reports. When I was sure the road was clear, I started walking east toward the service gate. I kept to the tree line, moving slow, watching every trail. By midday, I reached the old perimeter fence, slipped through a gap in the wire, and followed the disused access road into town. I knew where to go. Dr. Elaine Morgan kept an office above, a bookshop that smelled like damp paper and varnish. She'd spent years cataloging ancient sites' ruins. No one paid much attention to until a handful of researchers started linking them to anomalous transmissions. I climbed the narrow staircase at the back of the shop, boots leaving muddy prints. On the worn steps, when I knocked, the door opened halfway. She peered out at me, her expression tense, like she was expecting someone else. "Halle," she said. Her voice was softer than I remembered. "I thought you were still overseas." "I need to talk," I said. She stepped aside. I slipped past her into the office. Stacks of monographs and half-catalogued photos crowded the shelves. On the desk, a map of the Aegean lay pinned under a brass lamp, the island of Delos circled in red ink. "You've been busy," I said. "So." "Have you?" she murmured. She closed the door and turned the deadbolt. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I reached into my pocket and placed the shard on the corner of her desk. Her eyes widened. She picked it up, turned it over in her palm, and drew a shaky breath. "Where did you get this?" "Rendlesham," I said. Her gaze flicked to mine, searching for something confirmation. "Maybe absolution? I've seen fragments like this." She whispered, "Not here, but in Turkey. The same symbols, the same alloy. You said you were studying the patterns, I said. Did you ever decode them? Her hand closed around the shard. I tried, she said. But every time I got close, my funding vanished. Grants withdrawn, permissions revoked. Until finally, I understood it wasn't about the research. What was it about? She looked up at me, her expression hollow. Control. I didn't. Ask who she meant. I didn't need to. I pulled the folded map from my jacket and spread it across the table. Her hand trembled as she traced the line of coordinates. This is the same grid, she murmured. These sites Stilas, Gegekli Tepe. Sakara, these were the places the transmissions referenced. Why? She swallowed. Because these are the oldest places we've ever found evidence of organized human ritual. Whoever, whatever sent that signal was using them as a cipher. A way to mark the timeline. A sound behind us floorboards shifting. She looked past me, her face draining of color. When I turned, I saw the silhouette of a man in the doorway. Black jacket, no insignia. The same expressionless calm I'd seen in the forest. My pulse surged. Morgan dropped the shard into her pocket and stepped away from the desk. But the man didn't move. You shouldn't have come here, he said. His voice was low, tired, as if he'd been repeating the same line to people for years. I edged toward the corner, searching for something, anything I could use. A length of pipe, the heavy brass lamp, the steel drawer handle. But Morgan raised her hand before I could move. Wait, she whispered slowly. She reached into her coat and withdrew a slim envelope. She held it out to the man. His eyes flicked to mine. Then he took the envelope, tucked it into his pocket, and turned back toward the stairwell. Neither of us spoke until the door clicked shut. Morgan's shoulders slumped. She pressed her palms flat against the desk as if steadying herself. What did you give him? I asked. Her eyes were damp when she looked up at me. Copies of the records, she whispered. My notes on the transmission, everything I had. Why? Because they threatened my family, she said. Her voice broke. I'm sorry. I felt the silence in my chest, a cold, hollow ache. You could have warned me, I said quietly, her face crumpled. I thought I could keep you safe if I cooperated. But it doesn't matter, does it? They'll never stop. I picked up the shard from her desk. They're not going to have everything. I said. She didn't try to stop me when I slipped the map back into my jacket. I walked to the door and paused. You need to leave, I said. They'll come back. She didn't argue. I stepped into the hall. The stairs creaked under my boots. At the foot of the staircase, I looked back once. She stood in the doorway, hands pressed over her mouth. For the first time since the clearing, I felt something close to certainty. There were no safe places left, and the only chance I had was to stay ahead of the people who already believed they owned the truth. I didn't go back to base. I spent the next 3 nights moving between motels, never staying longer than a few hours. The roads blurred together in the dark, narrow lanes, cutting across frostbitten fields, old towns asleep under sodium lamps. Every time I checked in, I used a different name. Every time I stepped into a new room, I listened to the quiet for the click of a tapped phone line, the scrape of a boot in the hallway. They hadn't come for me yet, but I knew they would. On the 4th day, I reached the last place I could think to look for answers. The archive was hidden in plain sight, tucked behind the public stacks of an old research library in Cambridge. The woman at the counter barely glanced at me when I signed in. My hands were still dirty from the road, the skin around my nails cracked. I looked like any other drifter trying to disappear in the back rooms of someone else's records. She handed me a brass key and nodded to a door marked private collection. Inside, the air smelled of varnish and dust. Rows of cabinets lined the walls, each drawer labeled in a script older than the building itself. I moved slowly, scanning the indexes for any mention of the symbols interlocking triangles. Concentric circles, the code that kept threading through. Every piece of evidence. It took me an hour to find the first reference, a fragment of a medieval chronicle, catalogued under a Latin title I didn't recognize. The translation was crude, but the words caught in my chest as I read. In the year of our Lord 1132, there came lights over the sea, and the ground did tremble, as a voice like the wind spoke to the monks in cipher. And upon the stones of the shrine was found the mark of threefold unity, I traced the faded ink with my finger, threefold unity. The same triangles burned into the clearing where Peterson had stood. Whispering to something no one else could see, I pulled the next file from the cabinet, a set of photographs grumbling Greek manuscripts, each page dense with symbols and diagrams. The notations along the margins described sky visitors, beings who descended under cover of storms to mark the earth with their signs. Those who hold the cipher hold dominion over knowledge. One caption read, I thought of the men in black uniforms. The blank expressions, the certainty that nothing I did would change the outcome. They hadn't invented the silence. They'd inherited it. I kept searching. Piles of fragile papers accumulated on the reading table accounts of visions, testimonies from pilgrims who claimed the same dreams. Binary sequences etched into stone tablets matching the same patterns. From the Rendlesham recordings, each record was older than the last dot by the time I reached the final folder. My eyes were raw from reading. The document inside was simpler one page, yellowed and torn along the edges. A single paragraph. It is known among the keepers that the vault was sealed before the first cities rose. Those who approach it will find the mind unguarded. The code is the key, but the price is the self, the vault. I thought of Peterson, his vacant stare, the tremor in his hands when he said the craft had felt alive. I thought of Major Reed standing motionless before the pillar, the same story repeating itself. Across centuries, in places no history book ever dared to name, I closed the folder and pressed my palms against the table, fighting the dizziness that rose behind my eyes. If the vault was real, Delos wasn't just another coordinate. It was a door waiting to be opened. And the binary sequence was the invitation. Outside, the sun had fallen behind the rooftops. The library was nearly empty. I gathered the last of the copies I dared to make and slipped them into my pack dot as I reached the exit. I caught sight of a figure in the corner sitting perfectly still at a reading desk. I couldn't see his face, but I recognized the posture, the dark jacket dot watching dot. I didn't pause. I stepped into the cold, forcing myself not to look back. My breath plumed in the darkness. The streets felt older than the city itself, cobbled. Lanes winding through buildings that had stood longer than any country's flag. I followed them without thinking, my boots echoing in the hush dot. I kept walking until the library was a memory behind me, because I finally understood why the same symbols kept returning. They weren't a signature, they were a claim, a reminder that the hidden had always belonged to those willing to erase the witnesses, and no matter how far I ran, the past wasn't finished with me yet. I didn't go back to the main roads dot. I spent the night in a disused rail yard south of the city, hidden between two rusting boxcars. I lay on a pallet of rotting timbers, the cold pressing through my coat, the shard tucked against my ribs like a second heartbeat. Every few hours, I sat up and scanned the shadows for movement, but no headlights came. No footsteps echoed on the gravel. They didn't need to catch me yet. They were content to let the fear work on me from the inside dot by dawn. I knew I couldn't keep running without a purpose. I had fragments of everything: Peterson's visions, Yeats's recordings, the symbols in those forgotten manuscripts, but nothing that explained why the signals had returned after so many decades. It felt like trying to assemble a puzzle with half the pieces burned away, but I still had the code. I spent the morning in an abandoned switching shack, the door wedged shut with a rusted crowbar. My breath steamed in the brittle air as I laid out the transcription sheets. The binary sequence from the Rendlesham intercept sprawled across a dozen pages. I read it again, tracing each line with my thumb, searching for a pattern I hadn't seen. Halfway through the second page, my eyes caught on a repetition I'd missed. The same grouping of digits repeating every 20 lines. I flipped through the records Yeats had given me. The same cluster appeared in the Turkish transmissions from 1967, again in the Mediterranean intercepts from the 70s. They were coordinates, but not in any format I recognized. I pulled a reference chart from my pack and began translating the groupings into decimal points. My hand moved on its own, the numbers flowing faster than I could think. When I finished, I laid the final sheet across the others, 8 pairs of latitude and longitude. 8 sites spread across the globe. Rendlesham, Delos, Göbekli Tepe, Mohenjo-Daro, Teotihuacan, a plateau in western China I'd never heard of, and an unmarked expanse of tundra north of the Arctic Circle. I felt the air leave my lungs. The last time anyone decoded a full transmission, they buried it so deep no one could find it again. I was holding proof the same intelligence had been speaking to us for centuries or waiting for us to listen. I spread a faded world map across the floorboards, marked each site with the stub of a carpenter's pencil, and then I saw it. The positions formed a constellation, an array of points that mirrored a star pattern I couldn't name. The same formation etched into the shard I'd carried from the clearing. It wasn't a random list. It was a map meant to be recognized. Only when someone assembled every fragment. The knowledge pulled at something deeper than fear. A question that had been growing since the first time I saw the clearing burned into the frost. What if these messages weren't meant for everyone? What if they were meant for the few who refused to look away? I ran my palm across the map, feeling the paper crease. Under my fingers. My mind replayed Peterson's voice in the infirmary. It showed me something older than any of us. I wondered if this was what he'd seen. Or if it was only the threshold of something waiting on the other side. Noise snapped me out of it, a scrape against the concrete outside the shack. I killed the lantern and drew the shard from my pocket, clutching it in my fist. The footsteps were measured, careful. I didn't move. A sliver of light broke under the door as someone shifted against it, testing the lock. Then silence. I held my breath until my chest burned. When the footsteps receded, I counted to 50 before I dared to exhale. They were closer now, closer than they'd ever been. But I had the map. And if they were willing to follow me into the dark to keep it hidden, it meant the truth mattered more than I'd let myself believe. I packed the papers into my satchel, folded the world map last. My hands were steady, though I couldn't feel my fingertips anymore. I didn't know if I was running to something or away, only that every step carried me closer to De La Sand, the vault that waited beneath its ruins, because whatever price the code demanded, I was already paying it. I left the switching shack before dawn, moving south along the disused rail line. I kept my head down, the satchel strapped tight across my chest, every step a rehearsal of the same thought. Delos was no longer a place on a list. It was the fulcrum. A place where the pattern had surfaced again and again. I'd barely cleared the edge of town when I heard the car trailing me, tires crackling over loose gravel, engine throttled low to mask the sound. I didn't stop, just kept walking until the road curved behind an overgrown hedgerow. Then I stepped off the shoulder and crouched low in the ditch. The car rolled past black sedan, windows mirrored. For an instant, I caught a profile in the back seat. A woman. I didn't recognize her face, lit by the glow of a phone screen. She didn't look up. They weren't trying to catch me yet. Just keeping me in their sights, I waited until the engine faded into the distance before I climbed back onto the road. My boots felt heavier with every mile, like the map in my bag had grown dense enough to pull me underground. By dusk, I reached a village where the coastal buses stopped. I paid cash for a one-way ticket under a false name, then found a seat near the back and pressed my forehead to the glass. For hours, I watched the fields give way to the coastline. Lights flickered across the sea, pinpricks against the dark ships moving in patterns I couldn't read. Somewhere out there was Delos. And if the pattern was real, it meant someone had been listening since before any of us could measure time. I tried to convince myself I was prepared, that I'd accepted the cost of what I was doing. But the truth sat low in my chest, a knot that wouldn't ease. Because the more I uncovered, the more I realized the danger wasn't only the Watchers in their black vehicles. It was the factions. I couldn't see. I thought of the files Yates had shown, mere references to divisions inside the hidden agency. Groups who didn't agree on whether the transmissions should be suppressed or studied. One memo had described it as a Cold War within a Cold War, an invisible battle over whether the world was ready for contact. Some believed disclosure would collapse the institutions we'd built. Others believed the collapse was inevitable. And the only question was who would survive it. I tried to picture what would happen if I broadcast the coordinates. If the binary map became public, would it matter? Or would the same people who had buried the truth for centuries find new ways to drown it in noise and doubt? The bus slowed at a checkpoint. A uniformed guard boarded, flashlight skimming the passengers' faces. When he reached me, he paused, studying my ID. I kept my expression neutral. After a moment, he handed it back without a word. The doors folded shut. The engine rumbled to life. I didn't exhale until the checkpoint disappeared behind us. Somewhere in that long stretch of silence, I decided it didn't matter what they planned to do to stop me. The map wasn't an artifact to be archived. It was evidence that something had been trying to teach us, waiting for the right moment to be heard. And maybe that moment was now. When the bus reached the port, I slipped into the crowds moving toward the ferry terminal. My breath steamed in the cold, every step measured. My head low, I didn't see him until he was close enough to touch me, a thin man in a wool coat, a messenger bag slung across his chest. His eyes found mine, and something in them stopped me. Cold recognition. He fell into step beside me without a word. "You're Hale," he said quietly. I didn't answer. "I work with a group that wants the same thing you do," he went on. "They've been trying to keep you alive." I kept walking. "They're not all the same," he said. "You know that, don't you? The agency isn't monolithic. Some of us believe the knowledge belongs to everyone." I stopped. The crowd parted around us, the ferry horn echoing across the water. "Then why follow me?" I asked. "Because if the others find you first, it ends here." He reached into his bag and withdrew a folded packet paper worn thin at the seams. "Coordinates?" he said. "More precise than what you have. And a list of contacts on the islands who can help you get to the site." I didn't take it. "How? Do I know you're not the same as them?" His mouth twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You don't?" He stepped back into the flow of passengers and was gone. I stood there, the wind snapping against my collar. The memory of his eyes burned into my thoughts. I picked up the packet, because I already knew the only thing worse than running from the truth was refusing to see it. That night, as the ferry engines rumbled beneath my feet and the coastline receded into darkness, I studied the papers he'd left. Every page felt like a step deeper into the hidden war I hadn't asked to fight. But as the first lights of Delos flickered on the horizon, I felt something I hadn't since the clearing. Resolved. If they wanted to bury this, they'd have to bury me with it. I arrived on Delos before dawn. The ferry eased into the harbor without ceremony, its deck lights flickering against the ancient stones. No customs. No guards. Just a handful of workers offloading crates onto the pier, their voices low and indifferent. It felt wrong that a place so weighted with purpose could look so ordinary. I kept my head down as I moved along the quay, the satchel pressed tight against my ribs. Every step felt rehearsed, like I'd walked the same path 100 times in dreams I didn't remember. When I reached the end of the docks, I unfolded the packet the man in the wool coat had given me, a crude hand-drawn map, a list of names, a single phrase scrawled across the bottom in hurried ink. "You'll know it when you feel it." I didn't know if that was meant to reassure me. It didn't. I skirted the main tourist paths, slipping between low stone walls and collapsed colonnades. My breath fogged in the cold, blending with the dawn mist that drifted up from the sea. No one stopped me. No one even looked in my direction. By the time the sun cleared the ridge behind the old amphitheater, I'd reached the coordinates, a terrace of weathered flagstones, half buried in drifting soil. From a distance, it looked like any other ruin. But when I stepped into the center, the shard in my pocket grew warm against my leg. I pulled it free. The etched symbols seemed to shimmer, catching the early light like a mirror. My pulse slowed to a strange, measured rhythm I knew without understanding. How? That I'd found the threshold? I dropped to one knee, feeling along the seams between the stones. My fingertips traced a groove in the rockin' outline that hadn't been carved by time or weather, a perfect circle. Maybe 2 meters across? I pressed the shard into a shallow depression at the edge of the ring. Nothing happened at first. Then the ground shivered so subtle I almost thought I'd imagined it. A hairline crack split the stone at my feet, widening just enough to reveal darkness below. Air rose up, cold and damp, carrying a smell I couldn't place. Metallic, but older than rust. I hesitated, then I lowered myself through the opening. The chamber wasn't large, just a single vaulted space cut from the bedrock. But the walls were covered in markings I'd seen only in fragments Peterson's sketches. The old chronicles in the Cambridge archive, the intercepted transmissions rendered as geometry dot lines that curved and intersected in precise, impossible ways. In the center of the floor stood a sphere the size of a man's chest, resting on a cradle of black stone. Its surface was seamless, the color of liquid graphite. I stepped closer, the air thickened around me, pressing against my skin like water. My ears rang, the same frequency I'd heard in the clearing that night. I reached out, the moment my palm touched the sphere. The chamber vanished. Or maybe I did. I was standing on a plane that stretched to a horizon I couldn't comprehend. Structures, like spires and archways rising into a sky split by lightning that didn't fade. I felt something behind me, not a presence. A recognition. Images tore through me, cities built and abandoned before any language we spoke. Shapes hovering over oceans, marking the ice with symbols that outlasted every empire. And then the vault again, buried in a place no map named, waiting to be opened by hands that still believed in the idea of permission. The visions came faster, until they blurred into a single truth I couldn't hold all at once. Whatever intelligence had sent the transmissions hadn't just observed us. It had changed. US guided us. Made us. The realization broke something open inside me. I tried to pull my hand away, but my arm wouldn't respond. My pulse spiked and the air turned blinding white. A voice, if it was a voice, spoke a single word I didn't recognize. Then the sphere went cold. I staggered back, nearly losing my footing. The chamber reformed around me, solid and dim. My skin burned where I'd touched the artifact. I pressed my back against the wall, my breath ragged. Whatever line had existed between what I believed and what I knew, it was gone. This was real, and no amount of secrecy or denial could change that. When I climbed back into the dawn, the sky was the same pale blue it had always been, but nothing else felt familiar anymore. I stood there, watching the waves break against the rocks below. Somewhere behind me, I knew the watchers were already closing the distance, but for the first time since Rendlesham, I felt calm, because whatever they planned to do to erase me, I had seen enough to understand. We were never alone, and nothing they did now would ever make me unsee it. I didn't leave the island that day. I knew every hour I remained increased the chance they'd find me, but I couldn't make myself move. My body felt hollow, as if the sphere had emptied something out of me that I hadn't realized was there. By nightfall, I was still crouched on the terrace above the chamber. Watching the moon climb over the ruins, I tried to hold the images in. My mind cities dissolving in salt wind, towers crowned with that impossible symbol. But each time I reached for a detail, it slipped away, leaving only the certainty that nothing in my life had been what it seemed. It was past midnight when the boat came. No engine, no running lights, just a dark shape gliding across the inlet. Oars dipping without a splash. I knew it was for me. When the prow nudged the rocks, 2 men stepped ashore. Black coats, no insignia. One carried a small case in his left hand, the other a hypodermic in the right. I thought about running, but my legs wouldn't answer. The first man climbed the slope until he stood an arm's length away. He looked at me without judgment. "You've seen too much," he said, as if reading from a script. I swallowed, tasting salt. "Then finish it," I rasped. His gaze shifted to the second man. A silent signal. The one with the case knelt in front of me, unlatching the lid. Inside, a glass ampule nestled in foam, a syringe already primed. I couldn't look away from it. "You're not going to kill me," I said. The first man shook his head almost kindly. "No, that would be a waste." He stepped closer, his shadow falling across my face. "We're going to take back what you stole." The second man slipped the needle under my skin before I could react. I felt the burn in my veins, a cold fire crawling up my arm, across my chest, behind my eyes. My vision collapsed inward, the night folding into itself, and then I was somewhere else. I was back in the chamber, my hand on the sphere, but the images were shredded, fragmenting as I reached for them. Every time I tried to recall the constellations, the coordinates, the shape of the vault, The memory tore apart like paper in water that something was pulling the knowledge out of me piece by piece. Replacing it with blankness, I tried to hold on. Clamped my mind around the last clear detail, the sequence of numbers from the map, 37 degrees, 23 minutes, but the digits unraveled in the dark. When I came back to myself, I was lying on my side in the dirt. The men were gone. The boat vanished, only. The dawn remained. Leaking across the broken columns, I tried to remember why. I was there, what I'd found, nothing came. I checked my pockets. The shard was gone, the packet of notes, gone. My satchel emptied. My heartbeat thudded in the hollow space behind my ribs. I staggered to my feet, every muscle shaking. I knew I'd lost something I couldn't name. A part of me amputated so. Cleanly, it had left no scar, but even as I groped for the memories, I felt a faint residue. A shape where the knowledge had been. I didn't understand it. But I knew it wasn't entirely gone, because whatever they'd done, they hadn't taken. The conviction, that was the price. I could still feel the unshakable certainty that something older than any government had reached out to us. Had changed us. And no matter how thoroughly they stripped my mind, the truth had already taken root. I looked out over the water, the wind lifting the salt spray against my face. In that moment, I understood why they never killed the witnesses. Because oblivion was cleaner than doubt, and they needed people like me to walk away believing the knowledge was lost. I turned from the shore, every step heavy. But the emptiness inside me wasn't total. A fragment remained, hidden where they hadn't thought to look, the last echo of the voice in the dark, whispering a promise I didn't yet understand. And as I walked back toward the harbor, I knew I would spend whatever time I had left trying to recover what they'd stolen. I spent the next week moving between ferry ports, slipping from one island to the next under borrowed names. Each morning I woke with the same hollow ache behind my eyes, as though the knowledge they'd taken still pulsed in the empty space it left behind. Sometimes, in the hours before dawn, fragments returned, flashes of the chamber beneath Delos. The cold surface of the sphere, the impossible sky splitting open to show me something I could no longer describe. I would sit up in the dark, clutching the edge of the mattress, certain the memory was about to resolve. But it never did. On the 8th day I followed the last name from the list the man in the wool coat had given me. A safe house hidden behind the facade of an abandoned taverna near the southern cliffs. I knocked 3 times, waited, then knocked twice more. A slot in the door slid open. A woman's eyes met mine, dark and wary. "Halle," she said, as though confirming something she'd been told to expect. I didn't correct her. She unlatched the door and stepped aside. The interior was low-ceilinged and cold, furnished with nothing but a folding cot and a table littered with radio parts. She motioned for me to sit. "You remember anything?" she asked. "Some," I lied. Her gaze flicked over my face, measuring the tremor in my hands, the exhaustion I couldn't hide. "They used sodium thiopental," she said, "combined with electroconvulsive stimuli. Standard protocol for cognitive disruption." Her voice was clinical but not unkind. "Can it be reversed?" I asked. "Not fully." She opened the metal case on the table and withdrew a glass vial. "But it can be treated. You can recover more than you've lost if you have the discipline." I didn't ask her name. I knew she wouldn't give it. She filled a syringe and gestured for me to roll up my sleeve. "You'll feel disoriented," she said, "like you're walking through someone else's memories, but it will help." The needle slipped under my skin. The cold spread fast, and the walls of the little room seemed to contract. For a moment, I thought I might pass out. Instead, something broke loose behind my eyes. An edge I hadn't known was still there, the 8 coordinates from the binary map. Glowing in the dark, I gripped the edge of the cot, fighting to hold the vision before it dissolved again. Her hand rested on my shoulder, grounding me. "Stay with it," she murmured. I closed my eyes and saw the vault huge and silent under the earth, waiting for a key no one had been willing to admit existed, and I knew, with the clarity of a confession, that I wasn't the only one who had touched it. When I opened my eyes, the woman was studying me. "You remembered something," she said. I nodded, unable to speak. She turned away, retrieving a battered ledger from the shelf. She leafed through the pages until she found a set of names. "We've been monitoring transmissions," she said. "There are others who came close to what you found. Others who never made it this far." Her voice softened. "You survived because you didn't try to expose it alone." I thought of Morrigan, the way her hands had trembled when she handed over her research. The way she'd looked at me in that final moment, knowing we were both too far in to turn back. "You still have a choice," the woman said quietly. I knew. She was wrong. Whatever freedom I might have claimed had ended the moment. I stepped into the clearing that night. I set my hand on the ledger, feeling the indentations of the names. "I want to finish this," I said. Her expression didn't change, but I saw the respect in the way she inclined her head. "You'll need help," she said. "I know." She pulled a thin radio transceiver from her bag and set it in front of me. "When you're ready to move," she said, "broadcast on this frequency." "We'll come," I nodded. My throat felt raw. I didn't tell her that the word we sounded strange in my ears. That I had spent so long alone, I wasn't sure I remembered how to trust anyone. But as she left me in that cold room, the weight of the ledger in my hands, I felt something new beneath the fear, conviction, whatever they'd taken. They hadn't broken it, and as the first light crept through the cracks in the boarded windows, I promised myself that when the truth came out, it would be because I'd refused to let it die in the dark. I didn't leave the taverna for 3 days. The woman, no name. No rank returned each dawn with another vial and a question I could never fully answer. "How much do you remember now?" "Each time." I told her the same thing. Enough. It wasn't the whole truth. The memories came in flashes, disjointed frames of the vault beneath Delos. The sphere pulsing under my palm, the binary sequence unspooling across my mind. Every time I tried to hold the images, they tore apart, leaving the same ache behind my eyes, but I remembered the purpose. The promise that whatever waited at the end of this trail was bigger than any one life. And that was enough. On the morning of the 4th day, she set a battered satchel on the table between us. "Everything you need to finish this," she said. Inside was an encrypted radio transceiver, a sheaf of pre-written manifestos, and a collection of forged credentials that would carry me past most border checks. I lifted the last item, a thumb drive sealed in a black plastic shell. "What is this?" I asked. "Your insurance." She didn't elaborate. I turned it over. In my palm, feeling the weight of all the unspoken consequences. "If you broadcast this," she said, "there won't be any way back." "I know." Her eyes searched mine, as if she needed to be sure I understood what it meant to become a catalyst, and maybe she saw something in me that I didn't, because she nodded once and stood. "You'll have to move tonight," she said. "They've traced transmissions in the area. We can't protect you here much longer." I waited until her footsteps faded down the stairs before I unwrapped the radio. The frequency list was handwritten in the margin of a weathered notebook. Each station and outlet that had agreed to receive classified data, no questions asked, pirate broadcasters, dissident journalists, a handful of academic labs that had been waiting for proof their suspicions were justified. I spent the afternoon cross-referencing contacts, confirming fallback options. My hands didn't tremble. When darkness fell, I slipped into the back alleys of the village. The wind off the water carried the scent of salt and old stone. The same smell I remembered from the night I first set foot on Delos. I walked without hurry, as if the watchers might overlook me if I didn't look like I had something to lose. But when I reached the rendezvous point, a crack service shed on the edge of the harbor, I found the door already ajar. Inside, a man waited. He stood beside a folding table cluttered with radio equipment, his face half lit by the glow of a battery lamp. "You're late," he said. I didn't recognize him, but I knew the cadence in his voice. Calm, professional, the same tone I'd heard from the men who'd tried to erase me. He gestured to the equipment. "You have everything?" I didn't answer. "You can make this easy," he said almost gently. "We can walk out of here together. You disappear, start over." I set the satchel on the table. My hand never left the thumb drive. "You think this ends if I quit?" I asked. His expression didn't change. "I think you don't understand the stakes." I did dot better than he would ever know. I connected the transceiver to the field antenna. My movements practiced. My pulse stayed steady. Don't, he said quietly. I keyed the transmitter. The first bursts of data crackled across the narrow band frequency binary sequences. The map coordinates, the scanned images of the chamber beneath Delos, every secret they tried to bury, bleeding out into the world one packet at a time. The man didn't move. You just signed your own death warrant. He said. I met his eyes. Then you better make it count. A flicker of something respect maybe crossed his face. He turned and stepped into the night. I watched him go. The last signal still transmitting in bursts that would reach whoever was willing to listen. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel anything at all, asterisk, when the transmission ended. I powered down the radio and slipped the thumb drive into my pocket. Somewhere beyond the harbor, I knew the response teams were already mobilizing, but as I stood in the darkness, listening to the waves hit the stone pier, I felt lighter than I had since the first night in Rendlesham. Whatever happened now, the knowledge was no longer theirs to erase. I didn't wait for dawn. I packed the transmitter into the satchel and slipped out through the service door, moving along the edge of the quay where the shadows were deepest. The sky was still black, the horizon just beginning to pale, with the first hint of morning. The harbor lay silent except for the creak of mooring lines and the rhythmic lapping of water against the old stones. Every step felt like a confession. I knew the broadcast had reached them by now, the men in their unmarked vehicles. The hidden branches of agencies that pretended not to exist. They'd heard the code bleeding into the open, and they were coming to seal it shut. I didn't run. I followed the alley that curved behind the fish market, boots scuffing the damp cobbles. My breath fogged in the cold, steady, and controlled dot at the far end of the lane, a battered delivery van idled in the darkness. Its headlights were off, but the shape of the antenna rig on its roof told me it wasn't local. When I drew closer, the back doors swung open. 3 figures climbed out, 2 in plain clothes, the third in the same black coat I'd seen outside the chamber on Delos. The man in the coat lifted a small radio to his mouth. He's here. I turned, but a second vehicle was already rolling in from the opposite end of the quay. The headlights washed over me, pinning my shadow to the wet cobbles. I thought for a moment that this was how it would end, cornered between stone walls and the rising tide. All the truths I'd carried dissolving with me into the dark. But then a second thought came, cold and unyielding. They're too late. The broadcast was out. The code was in circulation, being copied and mirrored and picked apart by people who wouldn't look away. They could kill me, but the contagion of knowledge was already spreading. The van doors slammed. Boots hit the ground. I backed into the narrow gap between 2 buildings, feeling the satchel press against my ribs. Don't move. The leader called. His voice was calm, measured. He didn't need to shout, Dot. I kept moving. A figure broke from the group, rushing the gap where I stood. I pivoted and ran. Dot. The world collapsed into a tunnel, stone walls on either side. The rough rhythm of my heartbeat loud in my ears. Footsteps pounded behind me. I cleared the last row of buildings and stumbled onto a strip of wet sand that curved around the outer seawall. The tide was coming in, washing kelp and driftwood across the rocks. Ahead, a narrow stair climbed to the old watchtower, its silhouette stark against the brightening sky. I sprinted for it. Shouts rose behind me. I reached the base of the stairs, 2 at a time, climbing until my lungs burned. Halfway up, I glanced back. The men were spreading out along the shore, fanning toward the base of the tower. No more options. I reached the top platform and dropped to one knee behind the crumbling parapet. The satchel slipped off my shoulder, landing hard on the stones. I unzipped it, searching blindly. My hand closed around the cold shell of the thumb drive. Even if they took me, I could make sure the data would never vanish again. Below, the first of them started up the stairs. I thumbed open the casing and pressed the recessed switch on the side of fail-safe charge. One chance to wipe everything before it fell back into their hands, but I hesitated because erasing it meant the last intact copy of the code died with me. And the world would be left with fragments enough to seed doubt, but not enough to prove what we'd seen was real. I closed my fist around the drive, my breath ragged. The footsteps drew closer. boots scuffing the worn stone steps. I thought of Peterson, his hand pressed to the burned clearing of Morrigan's, voice trembling as she gave me the map she knew would end her career. Of the cold chamber beneath Gilas and the sphere that had branded its visions into my mind. The first silhouette rose over the edge of the parapet. I looked him in the eye, and then I dropped the drive back into the SATCH because if the truth was worth anything, it was worth risking everything to let it live. The man stepped forward. Weapon raised? On your knees. I didn't move. His mouth tightened into something that might have been regret. And then the second figure appeared behind him. Scanning the dawn horizon, for a moment, no one spoke, no one breathed. And in that thin, perfect silence, the sirens began to wail across the harbor an alarm that was never meant to sound. The last line of defense against the knowledge slipping out of their hands. I closed my eyes, feeling the wind whip across my face, and waited for the inevitable. I didn't look away when he raised the weapon. The sirens kept wailing across the harbor, echoing off the stone walls, drowning out the shouts of the men below. For an instant, everything felt suspended time stretching thin around me, the dawn light catching on the waves like molten glass. I thought about how far I'd come from that frozen clearing in Rendlesham, about how simple it had seemed then to believe that secrets could stay buried. If you only signed the right papers, but nothing buried stayed hidden forever. The man with the weapon shifted his stance. Behind him, the second figure reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder. His eyes locked on mine. On your knees. I didn't move, because in that moment, I understood that the choice I'd been running from was already made. I unzipped the satchel with slow, deliberate care. My hand closed around the thumb drive, feeling the shape of it ordinary and absolute. If they took me alive, they'd extract every detail I still remembered. They'd trace every contact, erase every copy, and call it a containment protocol, and the knowledge would slip back into the dark. I raised my hand to show them what I held. The man TENSED. Below. More figures were spreading out across the key operatives, moving in a loose circle. Sealing every exit, the sirens rose and fell, a rising note of inevitability. I could feel the question in every pair of eyes watching me. Would I destroy it or surrender it? But they'd never understood. It wasn't mine to surrender. I closed my thumb over the fail-safe switch. The first man stepped forward, his voice low. I met his gaze, and for the first time, I saw something like doubt flicker there. Not fear, not anger. Recognition. He knew, even if he'd never say it aloud, that the moment had already slipped out of their control, because the broadcast was complete. The data had seeded itself into servers and caches across 100 networks. Journalists, academics, rogue archivists, people who didn't care about clearance levels or plausible deniability. The truth was loose in the world, and it would never fit back in the box. They'd built for it. A voice crackled over the radio's urgent, clipped, "Stand down?" The man froze. His eyes shifted to the receiver on his belt, then back to me. I kept my hand on the drive. He didn't lower the weapon, but he didn't step closer. The sirens began to fade, replaced by the hush of the rising tide. I didn't know if it was over. I only knew I was still breathing. Slowly, I let my hand fall to my side. The second figure moved forward, sliding the radio back onto his belt. His face was blank, but his voice held a note I hadn't heard before, something close to resignation. "You're free to go." I searched his expression for the catch, the condition. There wasn't one. I looked past them to the harbor, where the first streaks of sunlight were breaking across the rooftops. Free. A word that didn't mean what it once had, because even if they let me walk out of that tower, the life I'd known was already gone. I stepped past them without a word. My boots tracked wet sand across the stones. At the bottom of the stairs, I paused, turned once to look back. They hadn't moved. Watching. Waiting for me to disappear into whatever anonymity was left. I walked along the quay until the first boats stirred to life, fishermen hoisting nets, gulls crying over the surf. Ordinary life resuming, unaware of how close it had come to being rewritten. In my pocket, the thumb drive felt almost weightless now, a talisman or a reminder that some truths can't be contained forever. By the time I reached the edge of the village, the sirens had faded to memory. And the world felt unchanged. but I knew better. I knew that somewhere far beyond the reach of the Watchers and their black archives, someone was reading the code, mapping the constellations, seeing the pattern for the first time, and understanding that the story wasn't over. Not even close. I turned inland, my shadow stretching long across the stones, and didn't look back again, because I'd already decided. The only way to honor what I'd seen was to become something they couldn't erase, a witness who refused to be silenced.